Okay, we're live. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. Today, we have a very important discussion lined up, and as most people probably know, that this year in April actually was the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, which was the first World Congress of the Afro-Asiatic people. Today, we're going to talk about the significance of the Bandung Conference, the Bandung spirit for this time, and the non-aligned movement that arose out of it. And we're going to talk about this also in the context of what we've been talking about in the last few months, about this idea of the New World movement of thought that begins with DuBois. And I think it's especially important because this is also, like, we're also nearing, and I think Sukarno talks about it in his introduction, that this is also the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, the first war of independence. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion today, and I'll ask Emily to begin the conversation.
Thanks, Shimbarto. So yeah, like Shimbarto said, this year is the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, which is actually not its formal name. The formal name is the Asian African Conference. And when thinking about how to talk about not just the significance of the Bandung Conference in 1955, I also wanted to mainly talk about what it means for today, and especially for free school, because like you said, Shimbarto, we've been talking a lot about DuBois as this world figure and as the origin of this world movement of thought. And the more you look into Bandung, and the more you actually go and reread the speeches of the participants of the Bandung Conference, the more you realize that the best way to understand the significance of that Bandung spirit that lives today in all its current manifestations, the current manifestations of an Afro-Asiatic people, and even the rise of Asia or the rise of China today, is through DuBois. And not just his life, but actually a lot of his thinking and the architecture of the way he described the problem of the 20th century as the color line, not just for America as a country, but actually the world. And we in Free School have interpreted DuBois, that phrase of the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Instead, we've also seen it as him saying the problem of modernity is the color line. And it's something that I think the participants of the Bandung Conference were well aware of. And I wanted to frame our, like, not just what I'm saying now, but the way we discuss the Bandung Conference in the world today through DuBois, because I think in a lot of ways, whether we're talking about the Black struggle or even the American democratic struggle today in this country, but even the world struggle, it has to be, we're kind of re-seeing the 20th century and redefining the 20th century, which has led us to today. So before I go into DuBois a lot more, just talking about the significance of the Bandung Conference. First of all, it was held in Indonesia, which at that point was only 1 year old. It was 1 year since its independence against honestly the very brutal regime of the Dutch. And a lot of times people focus on the British Empire or even the Spanish and Portuguese, but the Dutch were very brutal colonists, both in Africa and Indonesia. And Sukarno himself, the president of Indonesia, he saw Indonesia as a small African Asian country. Like, he doesn't call it an Asian country. He says Indonesia is an African Asian country made up of many different religions, including some African religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Eastern. So he sees Indonesia as a mix of Africa and Asia. And this is a side note, but I'm just really digging Sukarno right now because there's something in the way he speaks, and I'll read some of his opening address to the members of the Bandung Conference, and I hope you can see both how he is speaking not just as a revolutionary father of his country, but in fact this revolutionary figure for humanity who is doing exactly as DuBois said. What does it mean as a revolutionary to resolve the modern problem of the color line? And I hope I can kind of make that case when I read his speech. But the Bandung Conference was held in Indonesia, 1 year old. They're still even figuring out their electricity, their basic infrastructure of water, buildings. And so Indonesia took a lot of put a lot of effort into making sure that Bandung was set up for all these leaders of mainly newly independent Asian and African countries to come for this first meeting of Asian and African leaders of the world, all in one place. The significance of being in Indonesia is that this is the first time that leaders of Asian and African countries are meeting in Asia or Africa. So 10 years before Bandung, the forerunner of Bandung, I think, has to be seen as the Pan-African Congresses,
Right.
of which DuBois was a huge figure in putting together the very first Pan-African Congress in 1919. And I think there was even like I forget if it was called, I think it was conference. It was a Pan-African conference in 1900 held in London, which DuBois helped put together. And then the first official Pan-African Congress, where they tried to bring leaders of all these different African countries, including a nation within a nation, Black America, all in one place in 1919 in Paris. But 10 years after the fifth Pan-African Congress, which was held in Manchester, England, in 1945, you have Bandung, which is now bringing together Asian and African leaders. And I hope I'm not throwing too many facts at people, but the thing when I was looking at, I think the connection between the Pan-African Congresses into Bandung is very significant because really, I think it's something that I've only learned from preschool. It's so important. Today, we're so used to like hearing of Africa as such an underdeveloped place. But really, it's underdeveloped because it's been the most dominantly squashed of the world. And actually, the African leaders in Africa has always been at the forefront of putting together this vision of what would a freed world look like. What does freedom mean from colonialism, and bringing together leaders across Black America and even Africa together in these Pan-African Congresses, which sets the way for Bandung. And Kwame Nkrumah, who is not even the leader of a freed Ghana yet, he was in Britain at the time, and he was part of putting together the fifth Pan-African Congress in 1945. 10 years later, there were four premiers of newly freed Asian countries who decided it was time for Asian and African leaders to gather together. It was UNU from Burma, Nehru from India, M. Ali from Pakistan. That's actually five. Ali Sastro Amidojo from Indonesia, and then the premier of Ceylon, who came together at a meeting in 1954 in Colombo, and basically discussed we should really get together, because something that they all described is it's one thing to gain formal independence from the colonizer countries, but it's another thing to stay independent and to develop industries, to develop your economy, and be able to actually alleviate levels of disease, of illiteracy, of hunger, and of poverty, which was so prevalent in all these countries because they were all colonized for hundreds of years at that point. And most of the world is under the yoke of colonialism. And the reason why so many of these countries were gaining independence is also because of the war of Europe, the World War I, which ends in 1919, World War II. And part of the chaos of these basically wars of European nations is the colonies also wanted freedom and were fighting very hard for freedom across the darker world. So these five premiers decided to put out an invitation. And there's just something very beautiful and exciting about this idea that these leaders of these new nations, their people kept so poor, so illiterate, that these revolutionaries and these premiers were coming together and saying, what does it mean for us to make freedom real together and create a new world in the process on our terms, not on Western terms and not even on Western soil, but to come together as leaders and try to solve world humanity problems, things that concretely affect all people. And the four principles that they put on the invitations to make to all these newly freed Asian countries, and then even to African countries which were in the middle of fighting for freedom and were not yet free, were the principles of one, these are kind of the principles or goals of the conference. One is to create cooperation between African and Asian countries to reestablish what they call neighborly relations. Two is to be able to openly discuss worldwide problems affecting their people the most, the social, economic, and cultural problems, and what future relations could look like. Three was to solve what they called special interest issues, racism and colonialism. Was that even if your country is no longer colonized, there still remains these special interests of darker humanity, the existence of colonialism and racism, which has not been eradicated from the earth yet, to discuss that. And you can see in their speeches, because a lot of the speeches that you read from many different leaders who came to the conference, they were always bringing up one, world peace, two, nuclear weapons, what to do about nuclear weapons, should we ban them, should we eradicate them, and three, they were always referencing specific countries that they were all well aware of, were not yet free or in the middle of freedom struggles. First was Vietnam. Second were the North African countries, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And they also brought up South Africa. And the fourth, they brought up Palestine, which I think is relevant for today because, you know, today with the genocide in Gaza that continues, the Palestinian solidarity movement in the US could really benefit from reading DuBois, even something like The World in Africa, to understand what has been the trajectory of this era of humanity, the modern era of humanity, which has laid out that the problem that has not yet been completely solved is that of the color line. And how is that Palestine is just another, if anything, another more vicious form of a modern problem not yet solved by humanity. And it helps divide the line of genocide or humanity, war or humanity, peace or humanity. But that was really moving to see how much these leaders were like, they were basically saying it's not enough for our country to be freed. First of all, is it even freedom if the world is not free? And secondly, like our role is not just to free ourselves, our role is to solve a human problem, a modern problem, on behalf of God or Allah. And I'll talk about it later, but a lot of these leaders, it's really beautiful because they are very civilizationally and culturally and religiously diverse. And all of them invoked their own God in talking about the unfinished struggle to make human life beloved. Like, I actually really love this speech that the leader of Iraq gave. You know, Iraq, which we only know as the country that this country brutally invaded and ruined. And the leader of Iraq at the time, newly freed, he said, "Let us make Allah's words real." You know, it's not that, it's just very beautiful. The way that they found new meaning in their civilizational roots and religions in the fires of struggle for freedom. And the way it becomes almost a new religion, a religion that's much deeper and universal. Okay, but the fourth purpose that was put on the invitation of these invitations to the leaders to please come to Bandung, here's why you should come, was world peace, which I kind of already talked about. But that was the fourth core, where all of them saw that the number one common bond between all these countries was we demand world peace, because there's no such thing as freedom, but also there's no such thing as development. Like the concrete development of our countries, like raising living standards, alleviating poverty, like getting rid of disease. Like I feel like these are things that in some ways we kind of take for granted sometimes in this country, but these are real human problems that even affect the people of our own country. Illiteracy, hunger, poverty, disease. Like these were things that these countries, like really real problems that were preventing their countries from flourishing. Was even just discussing these basic problems of like human life, and that none of this could be achieved if there was constant war. So real quick, I just wanted to list, there were 25 countries that were present at Bandung. Many of them from Africa and Asia. I think all of them from Africa and Asia, and some of them are there, but they're not yet free, or they're in the process of becoming free, including, for example, Ghana, which would gain independence in a few years after. 57, so 2 years after Bandung. But there's Afghanistan, Cambodia and Prince Sihanouk, is the representative from Cambodia. The Central Asian Federation, China, Zhou Enlai was sent on behalf of Mao, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Gold Coast, so not yet even Ghana, but the Gold Coast still, it's still the Gold Coast, Iran, Iraq, Japan, Jordan, Laos, Lebanon, Liberia, Libya, Nepal, the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Syria, Thailand, Turkey, Vietnam, both the North sent a delegation and the South sent a delegation because they're in the middle of a not yet finished war, essentially. It's just after the Geneva Convention, which stopped the French war in Vietnam. And the American war in Vietnam doesn't begin until a few years later, but Americans are already involved in Vietnam. And like the Vietnamese leader, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, so the North Vietnam, their leader even talks about it, where he says, the Geneva Convention may have happened, but war is not done. And the war will never be done until the imperialists of America leave our nation and let us unite. So you can tell they're all talking about the specific problems of their countries that have universal ramifications of what humanity's struggle must be. Okay, Vietnam, and then lastly, Yemen was present. So all these countries of Asian Africa, like they even say it, even these 25 countries represent half of the world's population. And there's something beautiful about majority of humanity meeting in a darker nation to discuss the future and how the future will not be in the West, but the future must take up the East. The future must take up dark humanity. The topics, many of the speeches that they discussed were nuclear weapons, like I said, peace, colonialism. They don't say the word neocolonialism, but they discuss essentially neocolonialism, that we may be free from colonialism, but how can we actually be truly independent in our economies, our culture, our ideas, our relationships to each other? How can it be unmediated by the West? And how can we actually not just be trusteed? They call it trusteeship. How do we not just be under trusteeship of our former colonizers? And then what was also interesting was there were some speeches that also talked a lot about essentially ideology, but they used different words for it, like morals. They talked about morals, civilization, ideologies, culture. How do we nurture our own culture and not just revert to an imitation of our former colonizers? And I thought that was really deep. Okay, so, and I think before I'm gonna read a part of Sukarno's opening address, because I think Sukarno in some ways is he's a beautiful exemplar of, I think, the Bandung movement, because, the Bandung movement in the 60s merges into the non-aligned movement, which brings in Eastern Europe, like Yugoslavia. It also brings in the now like actually independent African countries like Kwame Nkrumah, Cuba in the 70s. I think 70s is when Cuba. In the 70s, Cuba and Latin America joined the non-aligned movement. Especially Fidel takes up a leadership role in the non-aligned movement, and it's significant because in the 70s with Latin America, with the leadership of Fidel makes the claim that Latin America must head to Africa, that we're essentially, in some ways, we are an African people, which was a very significant world move. But Bandung into the non-aligned movement, there's also the tricontinental movement. All of this is so significant for our times because we may not see it like this, but I think we should claim it, which is a lot of the world changes we're seeing, from even Ibrahim Traore and his fight against neocolonialism in Africa, to even organizations like BRICS, the continued meeting of the non-aligned movement in the world, where Maduro at this point plays a huge role in the non-aligned movement. There's many different organizations. Like I think there's the organization of, is it OASU or something? The United African.
African Union.
Yeah, the African Union. A lot of these manifestations in the world are here because of some sort of consolidation ideologically and civilizationally of this Bandung spirit.
Right.
That actually you can trace. If you trace it ideologically, it does end up back at DuBois. DuBois, the father of the Pan-African Congresses. And that's very important because just like the music symposium, we have to re-see the 20th century.
Yeah.
Like we have to see the 20th century as this collision of modernity, of human beings, of human consciousness, taking up this task of what does it mean to complete modernity? What does this mean to defeat the color line, which would allow a new era of humanity, a new civilization to be born? And the music of the music symposium is just as much a reflection of these changes in America as the Bandung Conference and all these anti-colonial liberation movements and later the peace movement are a reflection of like essentially what Du Bois created as this world origin, this world movement of thought that takes concrete form in human lives and human consciousness, which we benefit from today. And it's important for us to see it like that and reclaim it. So Sukarno, I want to read parts of Sukarno's opening address because he actually, I think, does talk in Du Bois's terms of modernity in the color line. And he also talks a lot about the moral force, the importance of the moral force in helping defeat essentially the color line or some sort of mediation of the West between nations, how the nations see each other, and how to solve not just national problems, but humanity problems, almost divine problems, like problems that almost God seemed to set out for human beings to solve, to meet God. But he says, Sukarno says, Sukarno, I just love Sukarno because it's just very emotional, but he says, as I survey this hall and the distinguished guests gathered here, my heart is filled with emotion. This is the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples in the history of mankind. I'm proud that my country is your host. I'm happy that you were able to accept invitations extended by the 5 sponsoring countries. But I also cannot restrain feelings of sadness when I recall the tribulations to which many of our peoples have so recently passed, tribulations which have exacted a heavy toll in life, in material things, and in the things of the spirit. I recognize that we are gathered here today as a result of sacrifices made by our forefathers and by the people of our own and younger generations. For me, this hall is filled not only by the leaders of the nations of Asia and Africa, it also contains within its walls the undying, the indomitable, the invincible spirit of those who went before us. Their struggle and sacrifice paved the way for this meeting of the highest representatives of independent and sovereign nations from 2 of the biggest continents of the globe. And he says, it is a new departure in the history of the world that leaders of Asian and African countries can meet together in their own countries to discuss and deliberate upon matters of common concern. And you should just know that because Indonesia is only 1 year old, like they didn't have the electricity systems even to keep the electricity, like the amount of electricity needed to keep up the system, the translation systems, the calls that leaders needed to make. So the people of Bandung, like Sukarno, in order to prepare the people of Bandung, the people of the islands, they sacrificed. Basically, the peoples like gave up most of the electricity for the day and only kept a few hours so that they could put most electricity into the actual conference. And if you look at like photos or you hear testimonies of someone like Richard Wright who's in Bandung, like the people of that island were so excited that all these leaders were coming, and like literally like as the taxis would drive the leaders to the conference hall, like I think Richard Wright described it as like you could see barefoot people of Indonesia running after the car because they were just so excited to even touch the cars of these leaders coming. And so it's just this new moment of history, of consciousness, of freedom. And then Sukarno continues, this 20th century has been a period of terrific dynamism. Perhaps the last 50 years have seen more development and more material progress than the previous 500 years. Man has learned to control many of the scourges which once threatened him. He has learned to consume distance. He has learned to project his voice and his picture across oceans and continents. He has probed deep into the secrets of nature and learned how to make the desert bloom and the plants of the earth increase their bounty. He has learned how to release the immense forces locked in the smallest particles of matter. But has man's political skill marched hand in hand with his technical and scientific skill? Man can chain lightning to his command. Can he control the society in which he lives? The answer is no. The political skill of man has been far outstripped by technical skill, and what he has made, he cannot be sure of controlling. The result of this is fear, and man gasps for safety in morality. Perhaps now more than at any other moment in the history of the world, society, government, and statesmanship need to be based upon the highest code of morality and ethics. And in political terms, what is the highest code of morality? It is the subordination of everything to the well-being of mankind. But today we are faced with a situation where the well-being of mankind is not always the primary consideration. Many who are in places of high power think, rather, of controlling the world. Yes, we are living in a world of fear. The life of man today is corroded and made bitter by fear. Fear of the future, fear of the hydrogen bomb, fear of ideologies. Perhaps this fear is a greater danger than the danger itself. Perhaps it is fear which drives men to act foolishly, to act thoughtlessly, to act dangerously. In your deliberations, sisters and brothers, I beg of you, do not be guided by these fears, because fear is an acid which etches man's actions into curious patterns. Be guided by hopes and determination. Be guided by ideals, and yes, be guided by dreams. We are of many different nations. We are of many different social backgrounds and cultural patterns. Our ways of life are different. Our national characters or colors or motifs, call it what you will, are different. Our racial stock is different, and even the color of our skin is different. But what does that matter? Mankind is united or divided by considerations other than these. Conflict comes not from variety of skins, not from variety of religion, but from variety of desires. All of us, I am certain, are united by more important things than those which superficially divide us. We're united, for instance, by a common detestation of colonialism in whatever form it appears. We're united by a common detestation of racialism. And we're united by a common determination to preserve and stabilize peace in the world. Are not these aims mentioned in the letter of invitation to which you responded? I freely confess it. In these aims, I am not disinterested or driven by purely impersonal motives. How is it possible to be disinterested about colonialism? For us, colonialism is not something far and distant. We have known it in all its ruthlessness. We have seen the immense human wastage it causes, the poverty it causes, and the heritage it leaves behind when eventually and reluctantly it is driven out by the inevitable march of history. My people and the peoples of many nations of Asia and Africa know these things, for we have experienced them. Indeed, we cannot yet say that all parts of our countries are free already. Okay, and then he says, this is what Chambarta was referencing. He says, and I beg of you, do not think of colonialism only in the classic form which we of Indonesia and of our brothers in different parts of Asia and Africa knew. Colonialism has also its modern dress in the form of economic control, intellectual control, actual physical control by a small but alien community within a nation. It is a skillful and determined enemy, and it appears in many guises. It does not give up its loot easily. Wherever, whenever, and however it appears, colonialism is an evil thing and one which must be eradicated from the earth. The battle against colonialism has been a long one. And do you know that today is a famous anniversary in that battle? On the 18th day of April, 1775, just 180 years ago, Paul Revere rode at midnight through the New England countryside, warning of the approach of the British troops and of the opening of the American War of Independence, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. About this midnight ride, the poet Longfellow wrote, "A cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore." Yes, it shall echo forevermore, just as the other anti-colonial words which gave us comfort and reassurance during the darkest days of our struggle shall echo forevermore. Okay, I know I'm reading a lot, but just a few more. He says, no task is more urgent than that of preserving peace. Without peace, our independence means little. The rehabilitation and upbuilding of our countries will have little meaning. Our revolutions will not be allowed to run their course. What can we do? The peoples of Asia and Africa wield little physical power. Even their economic strength is dispersed and slight. We cannot indulge in power politics. Diplomacy for us is not a matter of the big stick. Our statesmen, by and large, are not backed up with serried ranks of jet bombers. What can we do? We can do much. We can inject the voice of reason into world affairs. We can mobilize all the spiritual, all the moral, all the political strength of Asia and Africa on the side of peace. Yes, we, the peoples of Asia and Africa, 1.4 billion strong. I think I'm right. Yeah, 1.4 billion strong, far more than half the human population of the world. We can mobilize what I have called the moral violence of nations in favor of peace. We can demonstrate to the minority of the world which lives on the other continents that we, the majority, are for peace, not for war, and that whatever strength we have will always be thrown on to the side of peace. Okay, and then he ends and says, so let this Asian African conference be a great success. Make the live and let live principle and the unity and diversity motto the unifying force which brings us all together to seek in friendly, uninhibited discussion ways and means by which each of us can live his own life and let others live their own lives in their own way in harmony and in peace. If we succeed in doing so, the effect of it for the freedom, independence, and the welfare of man will be great on the world at large. The light of understanding has again been lit, the pillar of cooperation again erected. The likelihood of success of this conference is proved already by the very presence of you all here today. It is for us to give. It is for us to give it strength, to give it the power of inspiration, to spread its message all over the world. Failure will mean that the light of understanding, which seemed to have dawned in the East, the light towards which looked all the great religions born here in the past, has again been obscured by an unfriendly cloud before man, could benefit from its warm radiance. But let us be full of hope and full of confidence. We have so much in common. And he ends with, let us not be bitter about the past, but let us keep our eyes firmly on the future. Let us remember that no blessing of God is so sweet as life and liberty. Let us remember that the stature of all mankind is diminished so long as nations or parts of nations are still unfree. Let us remember that the highest purpose of man is the liberation of man from his bonds of fear, his bonds of human degradation, his bonds of poverty, the liberation of man from the physical, spiritual, and intellectual bonds which have for too long stunted the development of humanity's majority. And then he ends by saying, Bismillah, Godspeed. Yeah, Bismillah, yeah. And the reason why I even wanted to read that end where he says, let us remember that the highest purpose of man is to free the bonds of man, like free the bonds of man, not just from fear, degradation, and poverty, but also man from spiritual, physical, and intellectual bonds. And instead, in a lot of ways, he's talking about white supremacy. And white supremacy, which not only, like Baldwin says, imprisons darker peoples, but also imprisons the white people who believe it to keep them safe, but actually instead degrades them also. And the way he's basically saying, now that we have gained national liberation, let us embark on the real worldwide unfulfilled revolutionary struggle to basically do what even the Enlightenment talked about, which is actually free the individual human being from poverty, from hunger, from any form of suppression that actually infringes upon freedom. It's just really deep reading Sukarno because you can see how he's so similar to DuBois, where DuBois and Robeson both sent messages to Bandung because they were invited to come to Bandung, but they were prevented because this is the height of McCarthyism. So their passports were revoked. And both of their messages to Bandung showed that the very principles and philosophies underlying the African American struggle for freedom and democracy in America go hand in hand exactly with this worldwide struggle for freedom. That in a lot of ways, it's the same interlinked struggle of modernity to solve the problem of the color line. And Robeson even says, he's like, our government is not with you, but the common people. It was Robeson says, the common people of America, more than you may think, but I speak as one of the common people of America. The common people of America are with you. We belong with you. And actually, we're in the midst of a great democratic struggle, because this is already there are the seeds of what will become the civil rights movement in December of 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. Robeson is saying, I have already seen that among the common people, white and black, that we are actually with humanity. And DuBois also says the same thing, where he says, we in America have also been under the yoke of oppression. And we are showing, we in union with the world's peoples of Africa and Asia are showing that the path, that oppressed people will always be on the path for freedom and towards the truth. And he always emphasizes the truth of God, the truth of human freedom, to make freedom real. And I also think, but when you read Sukarno, especially when he talks about the morality of the East, if we can take the morality that these Eastern religions, these great Eastern religions talked about, and inject it into a modern struggle of the fight for human freedom, then we can actually make God real, make man divine, make freedom real. And I mean, first of all, that's not that different than King. A lot of his speeches where he's like, we've made great weapons, but we have not been able to make life. I forget the phrase. We've done so much in making weapons and science and technical skills, but we have not advanced ethics and morals. We have not actually solved how to make a human society where human beings can live. And so there's just a lot of evidence that I always was like, what makes Sukarno and King so similar in what they say? And it's not, I don't think they've ever met. I don't think they ever met. And actually, Sukarno was assassinated a few years later. And they never met. But it's not coincidental that Sukarno and King can talk so similarly. And I think the tie is basically the manifestation of DuBois's world movement of thought. This idea that there has to be a philosophy that comes from an oppressed people, that they all reach the same conclusion, which is that our struggle to free ourselves from oppression is not just about our own national liberation or even freeing ourselves, but actually a greater freeing of human beings from the exact thing that imprisons human beings. Whether it's white supremacy, it's an unfinished solving of what makes life worth living, of what makes human beings and civilization worth achieving. And so that's kind of
humanity struggle.
An all humanity struggle. And and I think I actually even wrote that it has so much relevance for today, where first, I didn't mention it, but this also historically, in this historic moment, it's very beautiful, because here you have King is about to lead. There's going to be this great Black freedom struggle in the 50s and 60s, and even continuing on in the 70s with the World Peace Movement, the contribution of African Americans to the World Peace Movement, even after King's assassination. But here, just at the moment where there's going to be an eruption of an American democratic struggle in the US, there's also this beautiful mirror of Bandung and the non-aligned movement, this mirror of peoples of the world struggling for democracy. And you have this interlinked struggle that still exists today. The struggle against neocolonialism is also the struggle of the American people against their own government for real democracy, for people's democracy, for a government and state and society that represents the will of the people. And DuBois his memorandum on Bandung, which I'm not going to read all of it, is kind of interesting, because he writes this memorandum on Bandung. I don't really know why he writes it, why he writes a separate memorandum. Is he just note-taking? I don't know where it goes, where it went. But he basically is making sense of Bandung and how it fits into his world philosophy of modernity, which at this point he's developed so much. He's done the Philadelphia Negro, he's done the Soul of Black Folk, he's even written The World in Africa. So he's making sense of everything that human beings are doing in the world and the way they've developed, and what does this lead to? How does it lead to freedom? And he has this point where he says, since the Renaissance, which is the awakening of culture in Western Europe in 1500 AD, Africa was drawn out of the Asiatic orbit into the European by the slave trade and American slavery. The tendency thereafter was for Asia to seek intercourse with white Europe, which was controlling her, and for Africa to do the same. So now the introduction of Europe as a mediator, that Africa and Asia, which always was unified, that was his first one. He said, 1, ancient ties between Asia and Africa were many. Read The World in Africa, chapter 4. He said that. Oh my God. He wrote that. He says, 2, Africa and Asia belonging together in human history. Not in modern human history, interesting, right? But in human history, Asia and Africa were always close. But that it was since the Renaissance and then with European colonization, Africa is taken out of the Asiatic orbit, and Asia does more, interacts more with Europe, and Africa also interacts more with Europe. And Africa and Asia do not interact as much anymore, or they're mediated by European colonialism. And he says the tendency thereafter was, blah, blah. And the policy of divide and conquer thus kept white and yellow and brown people from making common cause against common oppression. And this is also why DuBois today is such an important philosophy of thought to even ideologically get people on the same page of this thing of why is there divide and conquer? Why is that white and yellow and brown people, the masses of the world, cannot make common cause against common oppression? And it matches in some ways even how we're saying Marx and Lenin, these revolutionary theories contributed to their part of history, but it wasn't able to take humanity all the way. And Du Bois intervenes with his philosophy in the hopes of bringing world humanity, these newly freed countries, free from colonialism, and the world's peoples into a new era to actually complete modernity, complete freedom. And he also gives an interesting example. The third point of his memorandum is he uses Mahatma Gandhi. He says Mahatma Gandhi is the physical example, the living example of how the Asian looks to Europe and how the African looks to Europe, because they're both enslaved or colonized by Europe. And that the example of someone who could bring Asia and Africa together is Gandhi, because he says, in South Africa, Mohandas Gandhi defended the Indians against British oppression, but he also took up the cause of the Negroes. This eventually made the Indians and Negroes make common cause, despite the efforts of the British to divide them. And in some ways, he's saying that there must be a picking up of not just ideology, an ideological change, philosophical change, but even a new language of how to speak together, to speak on your own terms, to think on your own terms, and speak on your own terms. And that in some ways, Gandhi was such a leader of thought in making concrete what Du Bois was saying, which is how will Asian Africa, New Asian and New Africa speak to each other through a common language, common philosophy that's not on white terms or European terms, but distinctly modern and Asiatic or Eastern terms. And in some ways, you could see Gandhi's discovery of ancient philosophies put into the fires of modern freedom struggle as an example of the joining, creating a new language that Asia and Africa and even Black America can speak through. Which is even why I think King, in his pilgrimage to nonviolence, he says, I took up the task of figuring out what philosophy could free African Americans. And I went through all of European philosophy, which helped me in some ways, but I still ended up in Asia. I found my answer in Gandhi. I had to go to Asia, spiritually go to Asia, to find philosophically something that I could apply to the concrete struggle for freedom in America. Okay, so anyways, so 1959, it's a side note. So the relevance for today is also Du Bois in 1959, one of his last trips internationally is to China, where he gives a speech where he says, Africa, which is still groaning in chains, not yet free. Africa is always the hardest country to be free, because it's also the most put down, it's the most oppressed, dominated, enslaved country because of its resources, which is why Du Bois writes The World in Africa. How the world revolves around actually Mother Africa, and she is the most kept in chains. And that's what he says He says, Africa, learn from China.
Yeah.
Recreate this link in modern struggle to be free. And anyway, so and then in 1963, hi Jiva. That's it. In 1963, that's when DuBois passes away right before the March on Washington. And this Chinese tribute, this tribute by this Chinese author Bingxian, who I think Alice, Michelle, and I tried to translate. We translated it, and her tribute to DuBois has this really beautiful phrase where she says, like, while DuBois was passing away, he could hear the footsteps of Black folk marching for freedom in the March on, she's referring to the March on Washington. And it's kind of just the linking of all these freedom struggles. And today, the relevance for today is that I talked about all these modern expressions of the Afro-Asiatic spirit, that it's not completely dead, and actually it's more present than we see. Like the BRICS, the BRICS, the South, I think the Shanghai Cooperative, which is joining a lot of the Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian countries in unity. The African Union, which I think Ibrahim Traore is trying to reignite. There's a lot of young leaders of Africa who are trying to defeat neocolonialism and rediscovering Kwame Nkrumah's vision of a Pan-Africa, like a united Africa, something Gaddafi also tried to pick up, but he was brutally assassinated over. And this is in parallel with even the American struggle, the unfinished struggle to actually make America a real nation, even a complete nation where the peoples actually have a common bond in morals and purpose. And a new society, new systems, new cultures. So today, our struggle, I think it's proved that Du Bois identifying the problem in the 20th century is the color line. The problem of modernity is still the color line.
Yes.
The way that even not just economies, but our identities, our relationship to our own histories and our past and our futures is mediated by whiteness. It's still mediated by Europe since the Renaissance, as Du Bois identified. In that we will have to create new relations to humanity and to each other, like nations and human beings on our own terms, on Afro-Asiatic terms, which are not exclusive, but all-encompassing, all humanity. And Du Bois is the blueprint. And by the time of Bandung, he has already gone beyond the best of European philosophy and science, and that he sees the world in Afro-Asiatic terms that we can learn from. And yeah, and then I think just ending with that, I think Du Bois's new world movement of thought is concretized by Bandung at this 1955. And in America, we have to ask, what is our path back to humanity, ideologically and morally, so that we ourselves can bloom again in the midst of all these falling systems and a government that doesn't have any legitimacy, and everything that we know to be real or true right now is kind of in collapse. And there's an opportunity for us to make new relationships, new systems, new economy, and rejoin humanity's march towards a new world. So yeah, that's what I prepared for framing our conversation. And yeah, I also do recommend even reading some of the speeches by the people who were at the Bandung Conference in 1955. Which, oh yeah, I told Triva and your brother, I told your brother I was writing this play with Serafina, basically about what would the Bandung spirit look like today. And your brother was like really digging it. And I was like, okay, I'll write you a part in the play. He was like, I didn't mean like that. But besides even the big leaders of Bandung, like Nehru of India, like even Sukarno, Zhou and Lai, like even the leaders of countries like Iraq are really beautiful to read. Where he says, my last thing I just wanted to read was Dr. Muhammad Fadil al-Jamali from Iraq. And I'm a big sucker for pomp and circumstance too. I just love like ceremony, like this sort of stuff. So even the way he says, the Iraqi delegation is very happy indeed to be in this beautiful country of Indonesia and to enjoy the hospitality and grace with which the Indonesian people and government have received us. Well, because part of them going to Indonesia is there's lots of mosques. Indonesia has a lot of Muslims. So like the Muslim leaders of these countries would take them on tours of the Indonesian mosques and pray together there. And then the Christian leaders, I don't think there were many Christian leaders, but there were like the Buddhist leaders, they were like, we also have Buddhists, come to our Buddhist temple. Like, we'll show you what our Buddhist temples are like. Indonesia also has a lot of Hindus. So it's just very beautiful. There are pictures of like the leaders of all these different like countries of Muslim countries, you know, some are beige people, black people, brown people, all praying together in Indonesia. And so the representative from Iraq, he said, in other words, we peoples of Africa and Asia, while benefiting from the fruits of modern science, practical efficiency and organization, which are so well advanced in Europe and America, should not lose sight of our higher spiritual values and cultural heritage. Right. We must see it is that a well-balanced civilization for all mankind shall develop, whereby the fruits of the thinking of both Orient and Occident shall integrate, and that we shall have a human civilization, well integrated and harmonious in its composing elements. Integration and harmony between matter and spirit, between science, art, and religion, between individuals and groups within each nation, and between the nations of the world should be our guiding principles. To achieve this, we surely need peace. And then he talks a lot about North Africa, which is interesting because Iraq is technically Western Asia. He specifically talks about like how sad it makes him that the people of North Africa, which I think is geographically pretty close to Iraq, are still under the French yoke of colonialism. And he's basically saying like, we cannot have peace for as long as colonialism is in play. And then he also talks about South Africa, where he says color prejudice and superiority of the white man has led to discrimination against the Indians and the natives, and to the segregation of the so-called colored people. It is our sincere hope that this conference will prove in a very modest way to be a great moral force of ideological disarmament and moral rearmament, and that it will inspire the nations gathered here to become active participants in serving the aims and ideals of the United Nations, which embody the dignity of man, the freedom of individuals and of peoples, international cooperation and free exchange in the field of economics, science, art, and religion. To achieve that, we must strive to clean our hearts and minds. May I conclude with the meaning of a verse from the Holy Quran, which I hope will be applicable to all of us here and to all those who are not with us but share our earnest desire for peace. Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change from within themselves. Yeah, so it's kind of funny because actually even their references to the Quran, I don't find it that different from the Nation of Islam. Yeah, where it's almost like, I actually think the Islam that these leaders of these freedom movements, the way they use it as basically this moral weapon for change is so similar to in some ways the Nation of Islam. And it kind of just shows that countries like even Saudi Arabia today, which are kind of Muslim in rules, but not really Muslim in values. Like, you know, like, do you guys know the show Love is Blind? Like, there's literally a Love is Blind Habibi, which is set in Saudi Arabia. And I'm like, any country, so-called Muslim country that's letting like this reality TV show set like young people up over Love is Blind, where they're like talking about sex. You let them go on Love is Blind, but you don't let women drive. That's something like Nanato was telling me. She was pointing that out to me, where it's not about Islam, but it's about how these countries were using their civilizational roots and religions and almost transforming them and giving them deeper meaning in the fires of struggle. And so, I just wanted to end. I really liked, I just thought it was I just really enjoyed seeing even a country like Iraq, the way they were making sense of like their role in this in what they want to become a new world. I'll officially end there. And I'm sorry I talked so much. I talked for like basically an hour. More. 2 hours.
So I'm really glad you shared that because I mean, everyone knows Emily's my friend, but at the same time, I was like, that was incredible from a revolutionary perspective. And start, I guess I wanted to start. Like, there's a bunch of thoughts in my mind.
Speak up just.
Yeah, there are many thoughts in my mind, but what I'll start with is where Sukarno talks about let not fear control you, but also dreams. And I guess adding to the part of fears is also what King often talks about, which is disappointment. And that because of those things, that people give up the beauty of dreams. And I guess I also speak as, American of Chinese ancestry, growing up in this country where you don't learn about the history of the world through truth, but actually through the lens of white America. And which is to say that it's Asia and Africa have nothing to offer, but actually, and they're backward. And actually, it's only through the West that you can come into modernity. And I don't think I could have understood Bandung unless having known DuBois and King in America. Because as Emily was going through for describing Bandung, I thought a lot about Du Bois's chapter of the Sons of Masters and Men, in which a bunch of us had read together, because in Of the Sons of Masters and Men, Du Bois talks about the contact of civilizations, where he envisions and puts forward, or he describes the current conditions where civilizations under white supremacy, you only see the worst in each other. But what about a contact of civilizations where it's actually the best of civilizations, where you get to share art, science, philosophy. And he writes Of the Sons of Masters and Men in 1903, or it's part of his 1903 collection of Souls of Black Folk. And this precedes, a lot of the movements that come after. And I guess even one example of the contact of civilizations is, I think recently there's been a lot of tension around immigrants, this whole thing of immigrants. And something that has stood out is that essentially because of India and China's relative positions in the world, there's this perception of the good Asian and the bad Asian, who is closer to the white man. And it also makes me sad because I've been to China a couple of times, and one of the most memorable ones was when I went to this place along the Silk Road that connected India and China for centuries. And there's an economic exchange, but also religious and philosophical, where that's even why China is such a major country of Buddhism, because it came from India. But how has that relationship been disrupted? When did the relationship between India become so contentious? And it does start with when colonialism, and even the concrete example, and something that always stands out is the growing of opium in India to be exported to China. And I guess I just bring that example up because it's just something that's so top of mind recently, I think, for me. But the other thing is, then now, I guess I've kind of covered the ancestry part, but being an American, what does this mean? And I had appreciated a lot of the comments that you had gave. And it's always interesting because these leaders are always referencing Western ideals, where of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, of the American Revolution, the ideals of democracy and man, but has not been completed by the West and actually been corrupted. And it's actually through these struggles for independence that you see the purest, or I don't know if it's the purest, but the actual experiment and the continuation of these ideals. And I actually wanted to read a piece of the Bandung speech that Sukarno gives too, because it reminded me of something that Baldwin had said, which is that no one has ever wanted to be free. And the way that I had interpreted what Baldwin was saying is that actually freedom is something that comes with responsibility. With freedom, you actually have to make a choice. And in the part that you had mentioned, because Sukarno says that, like, now that we're free, do we want to imitate what has ruled us for centuries? And so this is the part where you're first good as well. He says, the burden of the delegates to this conference is not a light one, for I know that these questions, which are questions of the life or death of humanity itself, in the age of the bomb, must and more must be on your mind as they are on mine. And the nations of Asia and Africa cannot, even if they wish to, avoid their part in finding solutions to these problems. For that is part of the duties of independence itself. That is part of the price we gladly pay for our independence. For many generations, our peoples have been the voiceless ones in the world. We have been the unregarded, the peoples for whom decisions were made by others, whose interests were paramount, the peoples who lived in poverty and humiliation. Then our nations demanded, nay, fought for independence and achieved independence. And with that independence came responsibility. We have heavy responsibilities to ourselves and to the world and to the yet unborn generations, but we do not regret them. In 1945, the first year of our national revolution, we of Indonesia were confronted with the question of what we were going to do with our independence when it was finally attained and secured. We never questioned that it would be attained and secured. We knew how to oppose and destroy. Then we were suddenly confronted with the necessity of giving content and meaning to our independence, not material content and meaning only, but also ethical and moral content. For independence without ethics and without morality would be indeed a poor imitation of what we sought. The responsibilities and burdens, the rights and duties and privileges of independence must be seen as part of the ethical and moral content of independence. But that really spoke out to me too, because it does return to what our responsibility is. Because even now, as we see that colored modernity is continuing the spirit of Bandung and the non-aligned movement, there's a question in America, which is, what are we going to do? And it is through the example where you had mentioned in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycotts, for America and the American people to also join a new world in becoming. But yeah, I'm really glad we discussed this because I'm also writing something too.
You also what?
Because I'm writing the article for Avant-Garde, and it's that's the kind of thing.
So in China, I forget the saying, but they say we've had 100 years of repression and now we'll have 100 years of prosperity. And what I got from what Emily was saying about the Bandung Conference is something I've been thinking about for a while, because we have read these world leaders, national leaders. We've also read Marxists, and we've discussed philosophy. And there are many people on the left who are rediscovering Marxism, Leninism, and material science. But if we read these world leaders, what they're talking about, and the Bandung is this worldview of the all humanity struggle. But specifically, what I want to focus on is human beings' ability to overcome, and the ability for human beings to transcend, or whatever you want to call it. But this isn't materialist. There's nothing that this idea that humans have the ability to transcend their conditions, or to recreate their conditions, or to have a relationship with their conditions at all. There's nothing in that in materialist science. And it's so interesting to hear people like Fidel Castro, because I was having a conversation with one of my liberal friends about do I consider myself a communist? And we went and we talked about Hegel. And yeah, well, I'm with all the other communists. We have to go back and rediscover Hegel. something's gone wrong, and we have to go back to the roots. This trend, it's not just isolated to us as Marxists, but everyone. It's called, Kathy wrote about it in her art article about primitivism, and the trend for people aren't eating seed oils because that's not how cavemen used to do it. People are eating meat more, or people are interested in in Islam, the Salah, and Wahhabism more than any other time in history. And what's the assumption here that why are we so nostalgic for the past? What's the assumption here that just because they did it long ago means it's right? And there's also a trend in Western art. Why are zombie movies so popular in science fiction? It's because the West and artists in the West, they don't really see a future. What we've talked about in art, this relates to, I was talking about with Fidel, the way that these communists saw, their future. They don't, what art is an expression, not, an irrational or an unreasoned expression of what's going on in the human being. For a whole civilization to be unable to produce art that has a vision of the future is a warning sign. So to sort of get back on track, well, it's so important for all these revolutionaries to have a view, an optimistic view of the future, or a positive vision of the future. And this idea of the Chinese saying we had 100 years of oppression, now we'll have 100 years of prosperity, is similar to what Fidel is talking about when he gives speeches about the children, the child. And it's like they knew the whole time. They knew back then. There was no dogmatic approach. They weren't following the Soviet Union. They were carving their own independent path that no one had carved before. As many of as all these worlds, Sukarno, a world movement of thought was going on. And DuBois's role has really been erased, and so I appreciate this group's I was telling some people last night because about the Met Gala. The Met Gala had the theme was dandyism, and so I looked up dandyism, and there's a picture of Du Bois and no content. What's no context whatsoever?
Dandyism.
You ever heard of dandyism?
Dandy, where men who dress up really flamboyantly.
But it's like something is obviously missing where it should be filled in, and so you can deduce. But so what's going on? So to take that theme, what's going on in Marxism, Leninism, where we had this thought, we had a whole world we thought, and maybe where I'll conclude is the free school is talking about the epoch of Marxism, Leninism, and some people discuss it like it's closed. And if it is closed, what's the next epoch going to be? And but we always had access to it. Even the Marxist Leninists of Fidel and Ho Chi Minh, and they always had access to it. We always knew that this turn to humanity would always be there. So I guess my question to the rest of the group, given Bandung, given this non-materialist turn, I'll call it.
Yes. Can I say something? I appreciate what you're saying, Samir, very, very much. And these, like you say, these epochs of thought, very, very important. I know that's what we're in the science conference are going to attempt to create an environment where we can talk about these epochs. And, by the way, that was very moving, what you presented today, Emily. Very moving. And I think it brought Bandung to life for us in the 21st century. But I'm very interested in the epochs of thought, especially the question of when does one epoch end and another one begin. One of the moving things I think about Bandung and what it announced to history and to humanity is that a new epoch had begun. I think people have gotten Bandung wrong and non-alignment wrong, and certainly in this time, completely distorted. And if I, just a small example, India the Modi government tries to present its ambiguous and, in most instances, pro-West foreign policy as an instance of non-alignment. It isn't. Non-alignment never meant unprincipledness. It was the principled unity of Afro-Asia, principled unity. And it comes at the height of the Cold War. And, you know, having been around at that time, and I participated in the people's movements, the Bandung of the people, so to speak, the Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization, and then in the larger sense, the Afro-Asian Latin American Solidarity Organization, which was based in Cuba. And alongside the World Peace Council, and Ramesh Chandra, among others, you know, were part of all of this. But it is the Cold War. Okay. So are the previous and soon to not be colonized countries, were they saying that, well, we view the Soviet Union and the United States equally as oppressors? They weren't saying that. They were saying that a common civilizational and political bond of the people who had been colonized and enslaved was necessary to move history forward. Not that they were anti-Soviet. In fact, I think the Soviet Union had an observer delegation at Bandung. And clearly, the Chinese Revolution, which in many ways was the greatest achievement of Afro-Asia up to that point, the Chinese Revolution. And that doesn't take anything away from the Indian independence movement. It's just that, you know, you know, I think it's clear. And it was, I think, in concrete terms, the beginning of a new epoch. Now, the question is, where does that put Marxism, Leninism? Well, in many ways, maybe the Marxist-Leninists, quote unquote, have gotten the message, and they act like they're of an epoch that no longer exists. Does that make sense where I put that? You know, these small sectarian, almost bizarre movements who want to claim the future, but cannot. Bandung could claim the future because it had behind it the great struggles of the people of Africa and Asia. And they spoke to the future. Now, at this time, you had the Socialist Bloc of Nations, and you had the World Communist Movement. I don't know, and many of the communist parties were from the very, very same nations that that were at Bandung. In fact, Indonesia had one of the largest communist parties in the world. And when they killed Sukarno in 1965, they also killed 500,000 Indonesians, seldom spoken about enough. I think it had something to do with who Sukarno was, his alliance with the Communist Party of Indonesia, and I think the Western imperialists never forgave him for Bandung.
Wow.
But I guess the thing I want to say is that we're now in a struggle, an ideological struggle over how we bring Bandung into this moment. I see. There are people who would like to forget Bandung. The civil rights movement was deeply influenced by Bandung. I don't care whether it was Malcolm or King or whoever. Everybody saw the Black movement as part of the anti-colonial struggle of Asia and Africa. As Emily Point King makes it clear, my journey to nonviolence, I had to go to the East. I mean, it's like him saying there is not a philosophy of nonviolence in the West.
Oh no, I just want to add, I feel like, yeah, part of what comes up when, like, even the way that you talk about it in our overall discussion is, in talking about Bandung, we're not just talking about a past, but
Absolutely.
but we're talking about this moment in the future.
Yes.
And one of the questions is, Gracie Boggs is the way of framing it, but it's like, yeah, what time is it on the clock of the world? Like, where is modern humanity now, and where is humanity headed?
Yep.
And there are a lot of people on the left, like someone like Vijay Prashad, for example, who will look at Bandung through a pessimistic lens and basically say that Bandung failed. But it's like, well, first of all, how can you make that announcement? Who are you to say that Bandung failed? And also, but furthermore, how is it that you've decided that history has ended somehow? And you know, that these questions aren't still on the table, and they're not.
Well, one thing we learned from Bandung, imperialism is relentless. They don't give up.
Right.
And they are fighting to the bitter end.
Right. And
can I just say one small thing? I mean, if you don't mind, let me just no. You know, I think what Emily brings out, what Bandung brings out for now, is the centrality of the ideological struggle.
Right.
If the history going forward is the history of civilizations, a whole set of other questions will come to the fore. For example, the civilization state, the multi-civilizational state, a la India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which for the moment is ruptured. But, I mean, these are civilizations that are intertwined over history. What are you fighting over? I mean, what is the fight over? But certainly China, the civilization state, they have to perfect it and they have to define it more. Africa, Africa cannot continue with 54 countries based essentially upon the borders drawn at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. In other words, you are trying to live in a house produced by your oppressors. And until we think outside of that box, there is no possibility of Africa being free. Because the freedom of Africa, and I mentioned this about Martin R. Delaney, no people can be free if they're not a part of the ruling elite. In Africa and international terms, Africa cannot be free as a subordinate to the Western state system. And that's what they're operating on. The assumption of African independence is the Western state system, the so-called liberal state. And unless Africa moves towards a multi-civilization state, in other words, I contend that there are 4 distinct civilizations in Africa, not disconnected, but 4, and I define them by the language groups that make up Africa. And for the people, you get Afrocentrists who try to say, well, the Arabs are not African. Well, have you ever looked at a map? Have you ever studied the languages of Northeast Africa? Arabic is an Afro-Asian language. When we talk of Arabs, we're talking about a language group. The Saudis are not the same as the Egyptians in many different. But what makes them the same? They speak Arabic, an Afro-Asiatic language. I say all of this to say that Bandung is not dead. There has to be a renaissance. And I think part of what we're trying to do here in the free school is be a part of that human renaissance. I mean, my last thing I said, because we're going forward with the knowledge conference. And I think it's very, very important. And at the center of it is DuBois. I guess what kind of ticks me off the most is people that want DuBois that looks like them, thinks like them, acts like them. They don't want a DuBois or to study DuBois in order to be changed by these great ideas and their application in a new epoch. They don't want that. I could give examples, but I don't even want to drag myself through that sewer. But, one of the things we decided in Corbin, and they tell you more, is that we have to put DuBois, as you did, at the center of this new renaissance of knowing. And to find a way to make his ideas even more of a force at this time than they've ever been. And it's only the people, or people like us, who can do that. Make his ideas a greater force now than they were even at the time that he lived. And I think there's a case to be made for that. I just have one more small thing to say. Just like DuBois in his message to the Bandung said that the rise of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and of the axial age that shifts from the Afro-Asian world to Europe. And it was an axial age. But and thus the organic ties that have been developed over millennia between Africa and Asia were severed. That's the great, in civilizational terms. I think in a lot of ways, the word colonialism does not begin to explain the great civilization, the altering of civilization. Africa is the great example of it. These 54 nations is an attack upon civilization itself. Those 54 nations are an attack upon the civilizations of Africa. Hence, let me just say Renaissance. But to understand the Renaissance is to understand a stage in the reconstruction of the modern world. Now we're saying that modernity going forward has to have new foundations. And hence the study of the Renaissance is not to throw the Renaissance out. That would be crazy. Well, got a lot of crazy people, right? But to discover what is useful for the future. It's not to throw science out. It's not to throw philosophy out. It's not to take the nihilistic path of, well, the only option is to go back to the ancient African or Asian past. And I agree. I know I'm talking a little too long. I agree with you, Emma. I agree with you too, Samir. It is not to throw Islam out, but to make Islam a part of liberation of civilization and a rebirth of civilization. And I agreed with everybody. I know Eddie and I talked about this. we're going to interview Minister Ishmael Mohammed. And I feel it's more than an honor that this opportunity was given to us. And I don't believe that Minister Ishmael would be doing this interview if Minister Farrakhan hadn't okayed it. Which says something about how they view us. And it's a great honor. And I think they too have this concept of Islam in the sense of the Bandung delegates who were Muslim. We are here as Muslims, but we're also here as freedom fighters in the name of humanity. Not we're Muslims in the name of humanity. Not Muslims in the name of Islam. Muslims in the fight for humanity. If that's not the Nation of Islam and the second resurrection, I don't know what is. And that doesn't mean you have to be, we come as free school, as many religions here in the name of humanity. So I just.
Well, because I wanted to bring up that also with Bandung, if you read the introductory statements versus the closing statements, you can see, because basically they met for an entire week. And in that week, there were private meetings, there were larger sessions, there were all of these conversations and arguments among delegates. And but you can see the reflection of a change of thinking for even the delegates who came because of the conference itself, in which I actually think that one of the things that you notice when you read the introductory statements is that some of the more US aligned countries do kind of try to say the Soviet Union is like a new colonial power. But by the end of the conference, no one is talking that way anymore. And this is because there was also controversy around whether China should be invited because they're communist, all that stuff. And there was also some attempt to sabotage and potentially assassinate Zhou Enlai with a plane that was crashed that he was supposed to be on, but he was not on.
Actually, my grandfather's friend died on the plane crash. He told me when I was trying to discuss. Yeah, his friend was on the plane that was supposed to bring Zhou Enlai to Bandung, but they switched planes because of some scheduling thing.
Right.
And my grandpa was like, "Yeah, my friend died."
Right.
Well, that's the MO of the CIA in Southeast Asia.
Oh, say that again.
That's the MO.
Oh yeah.
CIA.
No question. No question.
And so I do think Bandung is in some ways a model for even what does this struggle of ideas look like in the modern age. Because there were different, a lot of the delegates say this, but we don't just represent different civilizations, but also different ideologies, different national liberation movements. And I think some of those questions are still open today. For example, like Turkey, modern day Turkey, where does Turkey stand in relation to NATO, the US, but also Palestine, and even the stuff that happens. So some of these questions I think are still open and still on the table. But I think one of the great achievements of the conference was that amidst all of that diversity of thought and diversity of cultures, ultimately they come out with statements at the end of the conference which are all unanimous. And this is, I think, one of the great achievements, which is that, and they all say this, which is that, we have some disagreements amongst us, but because we were able to actually find a common ground and discover what that common ground is, that is what allowed us to essentially come out with statements to the world which are completely universal amongst all of us. And I think that that is part of a testament to even, what if we're have these grand ideas about what does world democracy look like in the DuBoisian sense. Bandung is a kind of concrete working out of what this can mean. And I think the other thing I wanted to bring up is a point that you've made before, which is, we're living in a time today when humanity is more aware of itself and more aware of other people around the world than ever before. This has never been possible. And many people will say this is because of technology and the internet and all that stuff. But I think Bandung is living proof of the fact that really it is the anti-colonial struggle, it is these great movements and struggles of the darker nations, and also, yeah, you can see the world communist movement as well, which has made it possible for there to be a world, like, or maybe for the first time in history, like a true world consciousness. And at the same time, obviously, we can say that there are limitations, especially for Americans, and how difficult it is for Americans to know the world and to even know their own country today. But I think still you have to look at it as like what has been achieved in like the time that we live in right now is because of essentially what like these leaders, but not just the leaders, but the great like billions of people that they represented, what was being strived for in that time. And I think one of the other I guess to that, like one of the other forerunners for Bandung, I think, was also the Inter-Asian Relations Conference in 47, which was hosted in India, in which Gandhi makes a speech and he says, so he says to the delegates, so this is kind of a Pan-Asian conference in 47, but he says, what I want you delegates to understand is the message of Asia, and it cannot be learned through Western spectacles or by imitating the atomic bomb. If you want to give a message of truth, I do not want to appeal merely to your head. I want to capture your heart. In this age of democracy, in this age of the awakening of the poorest of the poor, you, Asia, can deliver this message with greater emphasis, and you will complete the conquest of the West, not through vengeance because you've been exploited, but with real understanding. And he says, I am sanguine, I am optimistic. If all of you Asians put your heads together and not your hearts together, not merely your heads, to understand the secret of the message of these wise men, these wise philosophers of the East, what they have left us. And if we are really to become worthy of that great message of the inheritance of Asia, then we will have completed the conquest of the West. And that this conquest will be loved by the West itself.
Wow.
And then he ends by saying, the Western world today is pining for wisdom. It is this is a repeat of what other people have said. It is despairing of the multiplication of atomic bombs, because these bombs mean utter destruction, not merely of the West, but of the whole world. As if the prophecy of the Bible is going to be fulfilled, and there is to be a perfect deluge, a flood. And it is up to you, Asia, to tell the world of this wickedness and sin. And that is the heritage of your teachers and my teachers that have taught Asia. And yeah, I think it's like a testament to like so much of the language, the way that these leaders talk, especially the most revolutionary amongst them and the most forward-looking amongst them. Like, I think it's both DuBoisian, but I agree with you that actually, like someone like Sukarno, it's crazy that this is happening at the exact same time that the Montgomery bus boycott is also happening, the exact same year. And Sukarno especially reminds me of King in his language and his basic formulation that especially the Western world's technological progress has outstripped the world's moral progress. And this is a basic theme in King's thought, but it's also a basic theme in Sukarno's thought. And I think it makes it even more, just like grotesque, the onslaught that was waged by Western intelligence and American intelligence, especially against countries like Indonesia, which coincidentally I think has the greatest population of Muslims in the world today. But I guess to that point, I don't think this was read, but one of the other speeches by Ali Sastro-Madjojo, who was elected as the president of the Bandung Conference, and he was the prime minister of Indonesia, and Sukarno was the president. But Ali, he says, let us, the peoples of Asia and Africa, not be overwhelmed by the revolutionary changes resulting from atomic technology, which will enter into our daily life and thinking. Let us be prepared for these tremendous changes, which I believe are not far away anymore. And they have to be welcomed in our minds and hearts as we step forward on the path of progress of mankind. But we have to be also aware that we cannot enter this atomic age with the same spirit, political or social beliefs, and moral attitudes which only befit the period which is about to draw to a close. We have to face the birth of the atomic age with a new spirit, new ideologies, and a new universal morality, which should form the basis all over the world. And indeed, the whole world is listening and watching us with hopes and expectations. Let us therefore all speak the same language, however much our tongues and our ideologies may differ, the language which not only the peoples of Asia and Africa will understand, but which will be understood by the whole world. and let us realize fully that it is our duty to make a solid contribution to the promotion of world peace and cooperation, and that let the rest of the world take notice that it is the voice of nearly 2/3 of the world's population which will be heard from this conference hall. And I don't know, yeah, just that language of like, we seek a new universal morality, even aside from like, yeah, we need new ideologies, new language and ways of thinking. Yeah.
See, that's it, Samir. That new,
Right.
and it comes from Asian Africa.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to develop in the knowledge conference.
Right.
Can I just say one thing? And so when Trump says, I'm not going to let Harvard bring any more students from Asia, now, which means, of course, Harvard will collapse. But I think if we take the spirit of Bandung, well, let's do for self now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think the last thing I want to say is that, yeah, there is another, just one paragraph from a closing speech by the delegate from Iran who says, so this is, and I just really like this because it's a very DuBoisian phrase, but he says, the delegate from Iran at the end of Bandung says, before concluding, I would like to add a few more words. On this bright Sunday of the 24th of April, 1955, in the green city of Bandung, the African-Asian Conference is proud, after a week of hard labor, to have given birth to a most cherished child, a child of the future with no special name, no special color, no special race, but with certain specific features in which we all more or less recognize ourselves. It is a child whose frail body symbolizes the sufferings and the privation of cruel though magnificent pasts, and whose insistent cries call upon the brightest morrows of mankind. It is a child whose hands seem already capable of giving birth and giving shape to the most fantastic dreams of our forefathers. And it is a child which it is our sacred duty to bring up with the utmost care and love and wisdom. And I don't know, I just really love that framing of it. We've given birth to not just like new ideas, but like literally they're talking about, yeah, like we have to go back to our countries. We have to go back to our peoples, peoples who have gone through this experience of colonialism, of like basically having their entire future robbed. And especially we have to speak to our children, the children of our generation who now are tasting freedom.
The new human being.
The new human being. And what are we going to tell, the children of our nations? What are we going to tell the children of the world? And I think that is it's very in line with DuBois' concept of the immortal child. And I don't know, it's just, I don't think you have to say directly like, oh, all of these thinkers were directly referencing DuBois, like being like, oh, I cite W.E.B. Du Bois in my speech. Like, it's not really about that, although many of them were aware of Du Bois, but it's more like Du Bois was able to start and capture and be part of that origination of, this world spirit, which basically overtakes mankind, and Du Bois prophesies essentially the ideas that are going to be the most important for this stage of modernity and for where humanity is moving. So I just wanted to bring that up as kind of like the last part that I was going to say.
Well, also that what you just read was so nice because it's like the phrase "a child with no special name," like right, no special name, where it's this thing of that we share one child. This thing of like we share one human future, one child with no special name, no special face? No special face, but we can all see ourselves in that child. I don't know, there's something about just like the idea that like your children are my children, that our future is one. And I think what's special about someone like Du Bois is like out of the specificity of him trying to solve the problems of his people who are not yet free in America, you can actually find a universal problem that imprisons the world's people and calls for a universal solution. Like, and we have to see ourselves with like, and we have to see that as basically one. Like this is one, like all humanity struggle. I really like that phrase of like a child with no special name.
I also wanted to say the way you started, which is to say that the 20th century needs to be re-seen or seen in a whole new light again. I think that's a very important way to frame it, because in some ways what we are trying to do when we study the Renaissance and all these philosophers of modern European thought, Enlightenment thought, is also to basically place, like Doc was saying, an epoch of thought in the context of the questions that are being asked today, that human beings need answered today. And I think the way you said it, that we need to re-seeing Bandung or putting it back on the stage of world history is to re-see the whole of 20th century and all these struggles that were going on in Afro-Asia to give meaning and substance to a new kind of world order, to a new kind of even human aspiration. Like, what does the human being strive for? What kind of life do we envision for our children? I think it's very important. And Doc, what you were saying about India also came to my mind when Emily put it that way, because actually, like, just to like clarify what India and somebody like Shankar, who is the foreign minister, will say today, is that the time or the period of non-alignment is over. And now we are all about multi-alignment, which is, and it's like, oh, this is a more flexible, more creative way where you're like responding to complicated force. And it is true, the forces that now are entrenched in India and the world are in some ways maybe more complicated and more insidious and not so outright as it used to be in the, you know, the first half of the 20th century. But then what you read from like the principles or the objectives that Bandung put on the table to discuss this thing of special interest issues, being colonialism and racism, I think what it talks about is a moral consistency. No, it's like you're talking about being consistent morally, being anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist for all of eternity, even if these struggles have already reached some kind of fruitful conclusion in your own people's struggle or in your own country. But then going forward, you are committed forever to hold that anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-racist position. And when Jaishankar says this sort of like loose thing of multi-alignment, I think it lacks moral consistency.
Absolute
You know,
transactional.
it's transactional because you're like, oh, we've solved this problem. We are going to focus on more immediate problems for the Indian people. And I won't even go as far as to say that he's a corrupt person. I do think like maybe they are making progress in terms of economic development, giving a better standard of living to the Indian people and so on. But what about this moral consistency that came out of so much sacrifice of the Asian and African peoples and was enshrined in, you know, these conferences, these big movements that involved millions and millions of people and not just their leadership. So that was one thing that I was thinking about a lot, because we all benefit from it. Like, even if you look at the instances of a peace movement or whatever form it exists today, they come out of these movements of people from Asia and Africa. And also, like, I think it's significant that Afro-America could not be a part of Bandung. Like, figures like DuBois and Robeson were kept. I mean, I guess Richard Wright was there, but yeah, but he, like, you know, but all I'm trying to say is I think it's significant because even the Western powers, the American state, realized significance of a conference like Bandung. They realized it to the extent that they thought that it would be a threat to allow somebody like Du Bois or Robeson to go there and be a part of it.
Who would represent the African people. And Richard Wright, the novelist, went under the guise of being a journalist from France. And Adam Clayton Powell, who was a congressman from Harlem, and you know, a record that's very sketchy. So he was literally representing the American government there. So you had, so you see what was there.
Yeah, and that also reminds me of what memorandum it was of the FBI or something that was looking into
Looking at it, yes.
Like, only to say that the American state and the Western powers have always taken these things more seriously than, say, Asian and African people know how to take these things seriously, even in this moment. And yeah, I mean, somebody like Jaishankar and the current trajectory of the Indian state, I mean, I don't like, they don't have a vision. They don't have this broad vision that even extends beyond the boundaries of India to imagine a shared future. And so I do think it, like what you said, captures it very well, that we need to reassess what this 20th century movement of thought but just movement of people was even about, and what can we take from it directly for now, and what still needs to be developed for this moment. And the other thing I was thinking about is, like, if you read Robeson's message to Bandung, like, he makes this point, and I mean, we've talked about this before. He makes this point that it's not lost in anybody anywhere in the world now that the problems that we're going to talk about, the problem of poverty, the problem of illiteracy, the problem of, all these concrete material problems, they are within the reach of human solution.
Yeah.
We have the technology, we have enough food, we can produce enough food in this world to feed every last person, a man, woman, and child. And the fact that this is not being done, it makes you question, what reason does the Western world talk about? What rationality, what science, what knowledge is it basing its supremacy on? When the only way you can, like, describe or try and explain this, like, human immiseration is completely against reason, because there is enough. You, like, purposely hold it from people who need it. And that's also why I think in Sukarno's speech is also my favorite, especially when he talks about the moral violence of nations in favor of peace. Because he's saying, on one hand, that we are going to be the ones who inject reason back into global politics, into a global vision for world democracy. But then he chooses to describe it by this very, like, counterintuitive turn of, like, even the formulation, which is moral violence in favor of peace. And so what he's saying is that we will fight for peace. I mean, whether it will be with arms or whatever it is, we will continue. The struggle continues. And the unreason of, like, Western domination and oppression, countered by the moral reasoning of millions and millions of people who put basically the meaning and substance into a movement for peace. And the last thing that I want to say is something that I was saying before we began preschool. Reading all of these speeches and looking at these movements really makes you see the modern peace movement, or the idea of a modern peace movement, very differently. All as a European project. It might have started, it might have needed a Soviet Union and a world communist movement to begin that, like, to basically, like, begin that movement towards peace, and not just peace individually, but indivisible peace for everybody. But it got its substance from the millions and millions of, nameless, faceless, dark human beings from Asia and Africa, who basically, like, it came from their organic democratic demand for their future and the future of their children. And I think that is also very, I mean, what we were saying about how the Palestine movement or any liberation movement has to, in some ways, understand what Bandung was doing, non-alignment was doing.
Absolutely.
I think that was very clear.
Absolutely.
I don't have that much to say, but I am interested in that connection that you made, Doc, about the all humanity struggle and the Bandung spirit, and
Yes.
how you were mentioning the importance of bringing up Bandung for today, how it relates to today. And I'm, like, thinking through, like, well, what, terms do we call Black people, or Black people, world people, and Afro-Asiatic people? But then the world in Africa, like you had mentioned, also came back in my head. There's a correlation between the oppression in America and the oppression of Africa, and how, like, neocolonialism or the British or the American imperialism functions. But then, like, I'm just interested in that, like, making a further connection on that all humanity struggle and the Bandung thing as it relates to kind of what you're saying, like, new stage of history, a breakdown, or like a realignment at the same time, like.
Yeah. Wait, can I say something? Because I was thinking something very similar.
Yeah.
Because the thing that had really stuck out to me in your remarks was when you talked about how the true ideological lineage of the Bandung Conference.
Happy birthday.
Aww. Birthday week.
Yeah, the birthday man. It's a challenge getting here.
You made the long walk to school.
He had his birthday.
Nice.
Yeah, we surprised him.
We're at the library.
Yeah,
Oh.
he was overwhelmed.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, that you backed it back to the first Pan-African Congress with W.B. Du Bois. And basically, so with Du Bois, there's something that I'm still trying to understand about that prophetic quality. I think it's part of the reason we like ascribe the New World movement to that moment. Because I'm thinking of how to say it, but sorry, I'm getting distracted. They're right in front of me. Well, I was thinking about something really similar because, for example, Du Bois writes that Princess in 1928, and I keep thinking back to that novel. So that's after World War One, and
That's in my head.
yeah, and so the main character is a black man from the South, and I don't remember all of the details, but he basically lied with the unfolding of the world freedom movement that's happening in Asia and Africa. And not only does he contact that movement, but he actually holds a special key that the rest of the world cannot see. It goes back to something that we talked about with like our study of revolutionary music or the music of Duke Ellington in the last few months, where Doc, you had said this thing of like, it's so advanced the consciousness of the world's people that the world's people are still catching up to something that Black genius and Black leadership already laid out after emancipation and like after Reconstruction. Because like back to something that either Emily or Jeremiah had read from one of the speeches of the Bandung Conference as well, they were referring to ideals of the American Revolution, right? But then what I started thinking is like, well, what if they had in their consciousness or in their knowledge, like the ideals of like Du Bois with Black Reconstruction too, which in some ways was already a step forward in the concrete construction of a new democracy under like the banner of those ideals of liberty, freedom, democracy. And like, I don't know how similar this is exactly to what Serafina is saying, but there's something that I'm still trying to put in my head together of for basically the dialectic between the Black freedom struggle and then the world and Afro-Asiatic struggle, and how in some ways you do feel like it's Western, or the intervention of the Western elite that basically prevents a certain fusion. Because like, I think what Serafina or someone else had brought up about Black America being missing at Bandung is like huge, because like I just keep thinking what would have happened if Du Bois or Robeson had been present. And then even this thing that you had highlighted, Emily, of the mirror between the Bandung movement and the Black freedom movement happening in parallel, I think is so significant and is even like a blind spot in my own chronology that I'm still trying to make sense of. But basically, like, there's something that I'm trying to understand still about the prophecy of the New World movement of thought, and then how it's concretely taken up by the world. And then that comes back for the American revolutionary process. And then it goes back out. Like, you know, and I think that's part of what we're trying to investigate when we're saying, how does the Bandung spirit live today? And what does it mean for our struggle here? But I just got excited.
Yeah, that also makes me think a lot about how the ideas of the Bandung and online movement have been set in motion and are alive today.
I'm sorry.
I think generally people do get the feeling that the world is shifting, being from centered around United States. Certainly, people do feel the world has not shifted from Europe. You know, it's been a minute since it's felt like that, and are shifting more towards Asia, especially China. My translation, let me do a beautiful article. And I think there's certain hysteria, feeling like, oh no, like, and this is from the West, everything that we've done to the world, now they're going to do to us. And it would be justified. Although that's not really the case. And so even, but what's significant is that these ideas, these principles on how to relate to one another as human beings, solving the issues that have been plaguing humanity, and are essential for our future, not just economic cooperation, but the principles of peace are and have been set in motion, and are even more significant for our human future today than they even were in that time period. And this, even though it's not, although actually I did learn that the non-aligned movement technically like still does exist and meets without, let's say, a very formal or ceremonial, I guess, manifestation. These ideas have been set in motion and have been alive with the people and are now coming into fruition, I believe, on very different terms today than they were back then. That makes it more pressing. Like for one, I'll use like China as an example. Back then, the world's people, at least from a technological and force place, were on not equal terms, were on much lesser terms, but they had the moral force of the world backing them that was more powerful. Well, now the technological and economic terms are such that Asia is even stronger and even challenges the Western superiority. And yet, that has left the door open and the arms open for the world to be with one another, and even the United States to be with the rest of the world. Similar to how the ideas of, let's say, the American anti-colonial struggle, the ideas of democracy and liberty, were done in a specific way in that time period for the American situation, but was open to and inherited by the anti-colonial struggles. These principles of the Bandung movement are even more pressing and are open to the United States, even, and given that peace now more than ever threatens the American people in ways that I think they are more conscious of. If the Trump movement identified peace as central for the future, in the way that I guess Bandung recognizes it as a condition, not just for human development, economically, but spiritually, morally, so that the world people can become themselves. Then the American people can go far beyond self-interests and basically peaceful, simply for self-interest, so that we can be a people.
Say that once again. What before self-interest?
Peace, not just for self-interest, so that we can be a people of the world and for the world.
Yeah, right.
And whether really it's been interesting because this development of the world's people to be with one another, as for example prescribed in the Bandung movement, the non-aligned movement, as saying, we'll cooperate with the West if that's what makes sense for us, if that's what suits us, on principles of positive peace,
Yeah.
as opposed to self-interest. That indicates, and I would even ascribe China's development be on these terms, not not turning their back on the world for self-interest, like let's say something more like Saudi Arabia, which can cooperate or turn their backs on the Palestinian people for cooperation with the West. Yeah, this call for positive peace, now that the West is not able to sustain itself for much longer, has been set in motion, and I guess is more pressing now than before.
Yeah, I think one of the, I guess, questions that's been raised too is what does it mean for the black struggle to see itself in the anti-colonial movements, and for the Black freedom struggle to be part of the world anti-colonial struggle? Because I think there are different ways of interpreting that. One of which could be, for example, like the Black Panther Party is one example of a manifestation where it's like Black people are not represented by the U.S. government, so we are going to send our own representatives of our own quasi-para government from the Black Panther Party to be representatives to meet with leaders in China and in Africa and stuff like that. And I think that's one kind of very literal way of interpreting it.
Right.
But I think probably the way that I feel like King saw it, and he kind of says this too, because I was trying to find speeches where King talks about the Bandung Conference, and he has this speech I think in St. Louis that he gives in '57 after like both out of Bandung but also out of the Montgomery boycott experience. And he basically says like a kind of recurring theme also in like his Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution essay or speech. But yeah, he talks about all the billions of people in Africa and Asia and what just that like he talks about the Bandung Conference, but he's basically saying that like what the Afro-Asiatic world is doing, one, like Emily said, that it is directly influencing the thought, the thinking, the politics of the civil rights movement, but that also like King sees that as like this is our reminder that we have to struggle to make America what it has to be. And I think actually it's much more relevant today too, because it's not just Black people, but increasing numbers of just Americans don't feel represented by their government. It's like this government, whatever it is, this state, it does not represent me. And so then what is the way that Americans in general, but especially Black America, can relate to the world? But I think it's part of a larger, almost philosophical recognition that, like as Eddie said, the light has moved to the east, and so this new light will come from the rising Afro-Asiatic world, which will then provide inspiration and insight and new ideas that are even necessary for the American revolutionary struggle. And I think that's also what, like, my interpretation of King's idea of like the world house is ultimately that, like, America has the potential to essentially represent a new kind of synthesis of we could call like even like an Afro-Asiatic synthesis, which is very concretely demonstrated through the taking up of nonviolence and the ideas of nonviolence. But it's also even like ironically or in a like interesting way, it's also even reflected in like something like the free school, where you have all these like Asian people who are now interested in the ideas of the Black freedom movement, and like we've said, like what has made that possible is essentially these achievements from the 20th century. But yeah, I think I don't know, I was just thinking about it, like open question of what does it mean, what did it mean, and what does it mean for the Black freedom movement to be part of the world anti-colonial struggle? And do you take that in a literal way? Is it more philosophical thing? What is the meaning of it? So.
Okay.
Well,
I also wanted to quickly add, because I was listening to Minister Rodney at Mosque 12 one time, and even though there's a lot of international solidarity, there's still a lot of respect for self-determination and for nations to choose their own destiny. And I heard from Minister Rodney, he described when Minister Farrakhan visited other Islamic nations, that I think he landed in United Arab Emirates, and they said, Mr. Farrakhan, you can speak about anything except for Mulana Muhammad and Farid Muhammad, because that would be, contrary to the Orthodox Islam. And, Minister Rodney said, Farrakhan responded in a way that was firm, that we're going to, express whatever we want. And Minister Rodney also said one time, if you're interested in a Saudi Arabia version of Islam, you can go to Saudi Arabia, you can go to Mecca, you can go to Al-Azhar, and you'll learn Islam from them. But you're going to be learning Islam from someone who doesn't support people in Gaza. When you have when you have the Nation of Islam that has unequivocally supported the people in Gaza, and called them human beings. One other thing I want to mention, which was we can't forget the scene in Dark Princess when Matthew is in front of the delegation of the world community, and he sings as a way to express his commitment or his contribution, his people's contribution to the freedom struggle, which is the music. And the music obviously represents something deeper, which is civilization. Music represents a striving for freedom, human overcoming.
Well, yeah, sorry, that what you said just reminded me, because I guess the other part of it, what we would argue in free school, is that it's not just that Black America and America as a whole can learn from the East or from Asia or Africa, but that's also the argument we've made, is that it is also the consciousness and even the social relationships of Afro-America, which has something to give to the rest of the world, and especially the rising darker world, in which these questions of what is modern life? What does it mean to be a modern human being? All of this, those questions have begun to be naturally, organically developed and thought through and worked out in the Black life world. In a way that I think has, our argument is that this also has something a message to the rest of the darker nations, which are also trying to figure out, their path to modernity. And I think to the other counterexample, what I also wanted to give was, we've seen this experience of all these students who were once part of the encampments for Gaza, recently making statements up there, and their commencement addresses and all that stuff. And I think it's a larger question, but one of the things that made me think about is there is still this question of what has allowed American students who otherwise would have no connection to the rest of the world to be able to actually try to take some kind of courageous stand, no matter how unclear it is or how much still has to be worked out. What has allowed them to basically be I don't care if I don't get my diploma. I still need to actually make a stand, and actually call out my own university for its guilt, for its complicity in the genocide. And it is that obviously we say it's the example and the kind of ripple effects of the consciousness that emerges from the civil rights movement, but it's also because all these students are watching young people in Gaza, and they have now an example, a kind of mirror for themselves that they see through the young people in Gaza. And it's why should I be scared for my career or my future when I know what young people and kids in Gaza are going through? And in that way, it's a kind of a direct manifestation of even what we're talking about of
And it just asks the question, what is my future to be?
Right.
But the reason why I have brought up the all humanity struggle thing, just to not move too fast away from King yet, because we've been reading King on Mondays, and the level or the space that King, the perspective in which King talks from is civilization, in the sense where he's speaking and how time can change, how humanity can really move forward. The level in which that King understood, envisioned, thinks about, and similar to DuBois, to be able to even to write Dark Princess is kind of a thing, not only that, like the reason why we go back to Dark Princess so much is not just because of a metaphorical or even entertainment as a novel, but what was it that was envisioned by DuBois and why? And the same thing goes with King. And we were reading, I forget the entire title, People on the Seashore, I forget. But
The Death of Evil.
The Death of Evil on the Seashore. And what's interesting is the whole conversation we had about evil. And it's like, well, why are we talking about this concept of evil if it were not on the level of a humanity struggles to overcome evil, or even in the space of history itself, to, like you're saying, the Renaissance as a moment in a new understanding of consciousness, or like, you know, modernity, and like what that would also bring in science, philosophy, meaning like there's I think you had said it, the world now knows each other, or like that idea that people have a new level of consciousness. And like, you know, King is also thinking on that term, or on that, in that playing ground where we are moving consciousness, humanity forward. So like an all humanity struggle is such an interesting concept to me, as it relates to,
because it reflects the level of consciousness of humanity.
And what it explains is like, well, what, like I think I'm actually kind of finally understanding like Herba, or I'm picking up a little bit from what the conversations that you guys are having about the science conference, which is the nature, or like the nature of the endeavor, of the development to, or like to manage to attempt to overturn another axial, or like to come to another axial age, to overturn, you know, in a way, but not completely, because there's still, like you were saying before, like I'm also very interested in Ibram Traore, or like I was having my own, like I was trying to listen to other interviews and things like that this week, and how the nature of the crisis. I'm like kind of going back to the same thing I just said, which I don't need to, but I'm just trying to like highlight why it was important, is because, you know, what you're saying is that without the music, or without like this, I don't know how to say, Black man, Afro-Asiatic, or whatever, you know, the revolutionary, because like the thing is that whether it be the African Union, or the not
African Union.
or like whatever's happening in Asia, there has to be the understanding of the revolutionary.
That's right.
I
agree.
Impulse, revolutionary striving, not, you know, because then it's like, okay, well, is China going to be modern without the revolutionary aspect, or like without like, and like, what does it mean, or do they? What is the context wherein China can become a flourishing like other people, or like, or even Africa, like on what value basis, on what moral basis, so that we don't ape white people, that we don't ape the past in the way that actually what you're saying about a reassessment of Bandung is not just to redo the past, which is like a very, like that's what Marxists do, where they read over and over again, like what Marxists say, and then all of a sudden they know exactly, you know, how to, you know, overturn capitalism. But like, what we're talking about is like getting to the moral and the value, like, and so another thing in my head is like, you know, I'm very grateful for this conversation, and I'm feeling a lot of love, and so that's coming back in my head too, about like, you know, how love is an ethic that is a human ethic, and Martin Luther King is also somebody that we go to study or to understand love better as a tool to struggle for freedom or whatever, nonviolence, or how it applies and all these other things. So, like, the all humanity struggle concept is important to me, but also to have the revolutionary essence, or like to uncover the revolutionary kernel within the strong, like within the long arc of the modern period into the 21st century is also an interesting endeavor, as we also try to like bring everything together, which is but
Well, I just want, because of what you're saying about King, I think it also reminded me of, say, where he writes in My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, he describes going through all these European philosophers, I mean, all of them, including Marx, but then ultimately he finds moral satisfaction in Gandhi. And I think this is true of Gandhi too. I mean, I think he got a lot out of Tolstoy and Thoreau and so on. But ultimately, when Thurman is visiting him, what he ends up saying is it's going to be through Black America that my message of nonviolence is going to reach the world. So I think what you were saying made me remember.
was so deep too.
Yeah, because what you're saying is these people, I think, because whether they said it this way or not, they were thinking about this as an all humanity problem or all humanity questions that needed all humanity solutions. It was easy for them to not restrict themselves to European thought or Europe, the stage of European consciousness, and actually try and think of, okay, no, what is needed for this time, and not like be dogmatic about anything that came in the past.
I don't know whether I should mention or not, because I'm like I'm kind of also thinking about what I'm like trying to write for the Sun Ra portion of the article, and like I'm interested in how people define themselves and are defined, because it's like, where did Gandhi come from? And I'm still kind of like, always inspired, or always kind of think about him. And I don't know if he said it, whether it be from the presentation or the speeches, or was it DuBois? But like, Gandhi concretizing that connection between Asia and Africa. Was it DuBois? Okay, yeah, and okay. So the other thing I was thinking about, just in correlation to that whole phenomenon, which is like no one really planned for Gandhi. But at the same time, like nobody really planned for free school, which is like a phenomenon in itself. But that's another thought in my mind where no, if you want, honestly, Doc, please, by all means, please. Like,
I'm just agreeing. It's so interesting.
yeah.
Some things are not predicted. What sometimes in theoretical physics, some used to call far from equilibrium dynamics, far from the mainstream of thought, and resisted by the mainstream, but reflective of certain deep trends in human consciousness. And I think that's what the music symposium attempted to discover. What does this say about human consciousness at this stage of the history of humanity?
And this, the whole point of believing something or having a positive vision of something is it's a lot harder than to have a pessimistic vision or no vision at all. Because if you don't have a vision of the future, it's a lot easier if you just get your paycheck to spend it all in 1 month. But if you have to put away, for your children, you have to plan out ahead. But it's also a degree, for people who are thinking about ideas today, it's a degree of laziness. Because if you're pessimistic, you say, "Oh, nothing is possible." or this is not possible, or this is a failure, then you don't have to go back and reevaluate. You don't have to do, what the free school does, which is, sit down and reevaluate or we were talking about rethinking Bandung. If Bandung's a failure, you don't have to rethink it.
I just have one last thing to say on the all humanity struggle question. I feel like one thing when Emily, you were giving your presentation, one thing that I kept feeling was that how is it that this, what you're also talking about, this positive vision for the future, this great optimism that it is possible for the people to take up struggle and change the course of the future and change the course of the whole world. How is it that it only comes from the Afro-Asiatic or the Afro-American, in the white world? Honestly, I was thinking about what has the white world been optimistic about in the last, I don't know how many decades. I mean, maybe AI. AI, that's the only thing that comes to my mind. But mostly it's just like the doomsday clock, the climate. And I'm not saying these are not problems. There is something to be said about everything is coming to an end, so everybody needs to now build bunkers and how is it that the white world has not had any cause for optimism in the last I don't know how many years? And I mean, wasn't you could see, like, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the United States basically becomes principal hegemon and all these academics and scholars are declaring the end of history, you would consider that to be a moment of great optimism for Western civilization. Look, we won, we won, and our terms are going to make the world a better place or whatever. And how is it that there has been no great optimism for the future coming from the West for so long? And isn't it so ironic that the people who have been kept out of the conversation, kept away from the dialogue table, oppressed, dehumanized, how is it that all of this optimism about the future comes from them? And I do think it is because of this. I mean, again, whether or not it's stated that way, it is because there is a vision of an all humanity struggle. I mean, even in Sukarno's speech, he says 6 years before this conference, Indonesia was in this existential struggle with the Dutch, where there was an actual war going on. And there was a blockade, not just material and economic, but also intellectual blockade. There was no exchange of ideas. But then Nehru convened this African conference of solidarity among African, I forget what the title was, but in 49, 6 years back. And he said, boom, that was it. The intellectual blockade in Indonesia was ended because we sent delegates, and when we heard from everybody convened at New Delhi that everybody was standing in solidarity with Indonesia, that was all we needed to keep our movement going forward. And we knew that we were going to win this, And I mean, I think this is also what Samir was saying. Like, when you do not attach yourself to narrow goals or both like temporal, not just geographic, you're not just thinking about a few years down the line, you're thinking about forever. You're not just thinking about your own country, but you're thinking of all humanity. I feel like without that, I don't know if it is even possible to be optimistic about anything, to have a positive vision for the future. And even this thing of, yes, there are differences between us as, in terms of race, color, this and that, but there's also so much shared. And in fact, there is more that we share in this moment, in this epoch of history, than we ever have. And so there is basis for optimism. The optimism is in our numbers, in how many people want the same thing for themselves and their children.
And it's also one of the, I guess, threads that was brought up in the discussion and presentation is how do you explain a Bandung? Like, how was it that they were able to achieve what they did? And I think that there's, the basic claim for them is that we were able to achieve this universality and unanimity because of almost a common civilizational value. And that this becomes the basis for ultimately what we consider to be, the world movement and all humanity movement. And I think it gets to I guess this is even stuff we're dealing with the knowledge conference, but I feel like, the whole Marxist thing over and over again, that the basis for the unity of the world will come from basically the fact that capitalism has kind of stretched its arms around the world and created a global working class, and that all of those working class people have the same experience, are all part of the same world system, and this creates the conditions for like a world proletarian revolution, I guess, is the phrase. And like, I mean, I do think it's an interesting question. How are people connected in the world, whether it's through ideas, but also, yeah, through economic systems. It's still valid, or it's still relevant to think about. But the point which is made by Bandung and which resonates the most in the 21st century is what can unite people is not just their economic position or their relationship to quote unquote modes of production, but it is their relationship to knowledge, to morality, to ideas. And I think that this places like a larger task on revolutionaries in this time. But I don't know, I just think because I feel like part of what has worked out is like, yeah, you had countries in Bandung who were not communist. You had countries like China which were communist, and this is taking place in the midst of the Cold War, and yet they were able to find a common ground and a common universal basis. And I don't think that lesson has been really taken up by, especially, like leftists in the United States. But it's that those lessons are the lessons and the openings that are the most present the most opportunity in this time and in the 21st century, rather than the arguments which are made basically by Marx and Lenin and all of them.
Well, I guess we're going over to the knowledge conference.
I just want to say one thing before we go to knowledge conference, but I guess it's related, which is I also was thinking about the question of optimism because it's kind of like that unspoken assumption. It's almost like it's an unspoken assumption in all the leaders who spoke at Bandung, despite the fact, and it's not like they're delusional. It's not like they're like just like, oh, happy, feel good people. But even though Sukarno was like, I'm really happy to see everyone here. Yeah. But I'm also sad because of everyone we've lost along the way from colonialism. But then throughout all the speeches, there is this unspoken assumption of optimism. And I feel like we're not even at that unspoken assumption of optimism today. Like, I actually feel like we are up against a lot of headwinds where it makes complete sense. And like, I guess that's what you were saying Alice, at the beginning, which is it makes complete sense why people would feel disappointed because sometimes it feels like we've lost so much. And sometimes it feels like we've lost our own memory or identity of like our own memory or identity of like even what happened, like even like the great struggles, like the great freedom movements of this country, like especially when it comes to the Black freedom movement, like Malcolm's 100th birthday, King, and all the like nameless, countless, basically ordinary people, heroes, who came from like many different parts of the country. And yeah, and I don't know, I was thinking a lot about the thing of optimism because we've been saying the word consciousness a lot, and it kind of just made me think that like, I think the number one part of human consciousness is can you envision a future? Like, do you even have a concept of a future?
This is the thing.
And like, that's the point of consciousness. Because like, sometimes I like get all meta when like we talk and we're like consciousness and this and that. I'm like, well, like what is consciousness? Like, what is it for? And then I was like, actually, I think consciousness is connected to like having an idea of the future. But then in order to have a vision of the future, you also, and like to be optimistic means you have to actually have confidence that there is a future and it's a shared one. And I also really believe in this idea that like you have to believe that there is something called the truth. Because like one of the deepest conversations we had in our year of ballroom reading group at the Central Library was like, it's kind of like a tug of war between like basically like younger people of Doc asked this question to like this one person, you were challenging her and you were like, well, before you go further, let me just ask you this question, which do you think freedom is real? Like, do you think freedom is a thing? Right. And I thought that's kind of deep because you were basically saying like, well, do you think freedom can be achieved?
And she said no.
She said no. But that's not just like a concrete question of like our lives, but it's actually a deeper, almost like a deeper like thing that also will affect not just whether you think there's a future or not, but also your own life. Like it's something that would make you depressed or give up or not want to change or not want to be with people or not seek human beings. And in some ways, you're basically not living.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I guess I wanted to say that, like, I also think the optimism comes from, I guess, two things, which is one, I think consciousness or a belief in a future, a belief that there is truth. And like our goal is to get there as close as we can to something absolute, like something 100%, like whether it's truth or freedom or justice or goodness.
Yeah.
It's like, I actually liked you bringing up King, that speech, because like I've been really into this idea of like, I do think you have to believe that there's something called evil, and you do have to believe in something called goodness. Like there is truth, that there is something called goodness, and you have to believe that it can, that good can triumph evil in order to like basically want human beings like as a species or whatever, but also civilization to continue on. And I think that's where that's kind of like the unspoken assumption of some of these leaders is they're just like, it's kind of, I guess what you said, which is we do believe that civilization should continue. Many civilizations. We do believe that there should be a future where goodness triumphs over evil, and children are fed and children live, and like that there is a criteria of good, and that good should like triumph over evil, which we're identifying as colonialism and XYZ. The other thing is, the last thing I just want to say is like, just this thing that there should be values, and where do they come from? How do you define good? How do you define bad? I actually think something we kind of, how to define beauty is one, all these leaders, what they all share in common is they also really love their people. They love their people. Not the high, like not the elites of their people, but they love the poor, the masses of their people. And it's something even Sukarno says, where he's like, I get really depressed because it's a lot of pressure to be the leader of a new nation. And then he was like, the only thing that makes me feel better and my security guard hates me for it, is if I dress in a little tank top. You know how like the Southeast Asian and Asian countries, like it's like the universal man, it's the universal ordinary man outfit, which is like a white little tank top, pants, and flip-flops.
Is it a tank top?
It's like, oh, it's a tank top. It's a white tank top. Yeah. It's the universal man outfit, I swear. And Sukarno was like, the only thing that can get me out of my depression of feeling lonely and being of all the pressures of being the leader is I put a tank top on, I put on slacks, I put on flip-flops, and then I'll put on glasses to disguise myself. And he's like, no one recognizes it's me, because his usual like Sukarno outfit is like a little Indonesian hat, a suit. And he's like, and then I make my security guard take me into the street. And he's like, and just being, I love what he said, that he's like walking amongst the people and having them rub up against me because they don't even realize that I'm Sukarno. They rub up against me. I can smell them and I hear them. He's like, I hear them talking, making jokes, and talking about romance and talking about life. He's like, that is the only thing that gets me out of my depression. And he also, and he says, he's like, the only way I can be a revolutionary, which doesn't just mean the destruction of the old and bad, but the construction of the new, is the fact that I'm an artist. And he says, because he's an architect, he's trained as an architect. He's like, the only reason why I like can go on and envision the future is because I'm an artist, because I have emotional qualities about me that basically make me love and appreciate beauty everywhere, and look for like new ways of seeing things and appreciating things from the people who he loves, like his people. And I just think like that's why I really liked our conversations about music, because I really think that you cannot be a freedom fighter or revolutionary without like one, seeing beauty, and two, like seeing beauty and basically saying like, I believe in a future and I know what it should look like. I think the future should look like the beauty I see in the village, or the beauty I see in North Philly, or the beauty I see in whatever. Like it should be like, the future should be like the innocence of a child who, like, even though their block is kind of like has some trash, they still have a lot of fun playing with their toys, like with their friends. Like, you know, like those values come from somewhere. Optimism comes from somewhere, and it comes from the people. And it comes from what makes life life, what gives life meaning, what gives life depth, what gives it beauty and complexity. And yeah, I just wanted to say that because I think it's a given. Like when you read all these speeches, you're like, you're feeling it, you're digging it, all that. But then you have to kind of also see, well, what are those assumptions that they have about being a freedom fighter and being a leader, envisioning the future together like this, that are things that we have to pick up again. And I do think some of it is like consciousness means you have to have a future. And I think you have to be, I think you have to be an artist. And it's why I think in free school we're always like, the revolutionary is an artist, and the artist is a revolutionary. And like, yeah, and I mean, I'm finally understanding something. DuBois has this essay, criteria of Negro art, but like he's basically talking about what's the criteria for revolutionary art, what's the criteria for like for being able to see, and he says he has this like I never understood it. He has this like paragraph where he's like, if you basically want to be a revolutionary, tell me when you're standing at the shores of a beautiful lake and it's sunset, golden hour, and someone's kayaking or canoeing or whatever, and it's like the figure of a lonely man at peace in his canoe on the ripples of the lake with the sun coming down. He's like, tell me, do you stand there and breathe and take it in? He kind of says, he's like, do you take in the beauty of that scene? And he's like, to me, that says something to me, whether not only can you make art, but are you a revolutionary? Do you have consciousness? Like, can you imagine? Do you want to imagine something more?
See, that's the inside out. You know, because whether you can recognize beauty in the simple things of life says something about the inside of you. And see, this is where the performative culture, performative revolutionaries, do such violence to the essence of revolutionary, what it is to be a revolutionary. But everything you said is kind of what we're grappling with and preparing for the Knowledge of Science Conference, because, we haven't solved this. Because when you take the whole, looking at things in their totalities and not trying to be, as it were, Americans, Trevor, and this is what I heard that you said. You said you don't know what it is to be, how do I be an American? Or is that something to even strive for? Does being an American contradict being a human being? But the other thing is that we're trying to work out, and I don't know that we have, y'all can say, this question of a new epistemology to know all of these things, to know beauty, to know the human being, to know, and not just to know systems, but to know people. And of course, that's what DuBois does with sociology. And by the way, we're looking at Kant and Einstein, relationship to DuBois and Lenin, because one of the things that the modern European epistemology did achieve is how to know systems, but not how to know people. And but maybe they could. But I would say so much of what you have said, just throws it back on us. I know it throws it back on me trying to write this article for Avant-Garde, and just a quick thing. You put the revolutionary in the framework of the struggle for beauty. I think that's so important, but because without beauty, you can't have the human. I'm not human because I think, like they call it, I think, therefore I am. In a lot of ways, I'm human because I can recognize the beauty in other human beings. And so, we got to, work to achieve that. And when you use the word optimism, I would put side by side with it confidence.
Mm.
You know, we are optimists, but we're also confident. I don't think, and I think that's what distinguishes free school. It's not a place for pessimists. I guess a pessimistic person, well, most pessimistic people don't get up on Saturday morning and come here to this every week. You couldn't just if you were a pessimist, but a pessimist is in it to prove the opposite of what they say they're in it for.
Mm.
You know, if I could just use, we might need to use these. Take the queer movement or queer theory. That is the most pessimistic, unhappy movement that ever has called itself a movement. There's everything about it is a negativity. And so, well, maybe it is a place like I know Jerry said, where postmodernism is a place where ideas go to die. Is that the way you put it?
It's an idea whose time has come to die.
Oh, okay. And I think the whole thing of postmodernism has to die because it does not see beauty, it does not see art, it does not see human beings.
Right. Well, I wanted to maybe like this is a segue, but I think like yeah, today's conversation really I think it really makes concrete what we've been talking about for the knowledge conference, but also yeah, to talk about DuBois. I really appreciated what when you begin to talk about all these countries which came together, it says something about yeah the basis. And I think I was also looking at like what people say about Bandung Conference now, who are who are the ones who are claiming to be the inheritors, and it's not even just the Bandung Conference, but it's all all the nations that came out of colonial rule. It's always sort of, and especially say India, it's always put down that the basis of this country coming together, or out of all these Asian and African nations coming together, the only basis is this short period of history of colonialism and so on, and it's used as a put down. But I think I say this because this is precisely the project of this is how Black America itself comes into being, and this is why all of these people are talking about, for instance, DuBois or Baldwin, they're making the claim at every stage that for Black America to come together as a people, you had to invent you had to recognize something about the human being, which was not possible before, because you did not have a shared language, you did not have shared basis, or you did not have obvious shared basis of civilization. So that's why yes, it's not an African people in America, but it's the creation of a new American people. That's the and I was thinking about this because of the way you put something today, Doc, that this idea of the terms of civilizational interchange, the terms on which civilizations can meet, and this is a question that Suparno also puts in his speech, where he asks, why is it now, like this is the first time that the peoples of Asia and Africa can talk amongst each other in their own house? And he's talking about, like till now, our interchange of ideas had to be mediated by the white world. It had to, even physically, it could only take place in Europe. All these, figures from the revolutionary movement, like they could like literally meet in Europe, in Belgium, and so on and so forth. These were the terms where they could meet, and this is the first time that this exchange of ideas can actually take place on their own terms in their own land. And I think now, like today, I think this is very important because we are at a stage of complete crisis in white civilization. And therefore, what's going to set the terms tomorrow for the interchange of the world's people? And I think this is where DuBois and the world movement of thought comes in, because we are in urgent need of creation of new terms, new universal terms on which on which the world's people can meet. And this is why, I mean, yes, it's not about differences in civilization and so on and so forth, but what everyone was saying,
That's right.
the unity in purpose.
Absolutely. Not
And
the clash of civilization.
right,
The unity of civilization.
right. And I think this is
And
why,
why does the West propose the clash of civilization rather than the unity of civilization?
right, right. I think,
I'm sorry.
no. I think, yeah, this is, I mean, I feel like this makes it clear that yes, like what you just said, why the West looks at civilizations in these terms
Yes,
is
yes.
because
Mhm.
white civilization has been forever tied to the project of white supremacy. And today that's not sustainable anymore. It can so white civilization is in a crisis, I think, because it can no longer find a way forward in a world which it can't rule. And therefore what's going to set these terms? And I say that to say that I think this idea of a new world movement of thought, I think one of the things that we are also trying to work out is this question that Samir brought up and then everyone responded about about a theory to explain this moment, to understand this moment in a way that we can transcend the crisis. And the question of the left, the question of what even is revolutionary science, what are the principal contradictions that give rise to a previous epoch of philosophy, someone said, or why we are saying that DuBois at this time is somebody who has to be taken up fully, not just for the American people, but for the world, for a new stage of human consciousness. And I think I think to talk about Bandung in this way, I think I really appreciate the fact that we were talking about Bandung because it makes it concrete that the New World movement of thought, it's not a movement of thought alone. We're talking about this thought, because it has led to the partial completion of the project of modernity. I think by bringing in by bringing by bringing the darker billions into the project of modernity. And this is literally what DuBois also is saying in his message to the Bandung, that after congratulating them, he says, do not he congratulates the darker billions of the world, and then he says, do not forget your brothers in bondage overseas. And I think what we are doing in some ways is also it's developing that, but also it's also a tribute to DuBois. I think the conference is largely an authentic tribute to what DuBois, the kind of unique life he has led, long and unique life he has led, and really his contribution today, his contribution of the 20th century, which perhaps now is the time that can fully be taken up to complete the promise of modernity. I just wanted to say that to
And it's it's an interesting question which frames the knowledge conference too.
What did we say we're going to title it again?
It's a work in progress.
Okay. Oh, that's the
We
title.
had one title 2 weeks ago. We have a different working. Well, okay. The current idea for the title is W.E.B. Du Bois and the New World Movement of Thought Towards Our Common Revolutionary Future. That was the current idea. So we're still working on it.
Oh, we tried to touch language. That's kind of
Well, I
long.
wanted to be the
Oh,
language.
yeah. I thought I did too, but maybe I did.
Okay, yeah. So work in progress. I do think it's part of the overall framing of Du Bois has this interesting phrase in this essay that we're reading in the Lucian Blackwell reading group, where he's talking about his journey to the rural parts of Tennessee when he's attending Fisk as a young man. And he's I traveled not only in space but in time.
Yeah.
And
That's what I had.
oh yeah.
Oh wow.
And I think I just bring it up because it's we've been talking about epochs. And how do you know when an epoch has ended? And how do you know when a new epoch has begun? And I think what we're living through is essentially the drawn out, agonizing death of an old epoch simultaneously with the birth of the new. And so that partially raises the question of how do you identify where the new is emerging and where the old is dying at the same time, and also in different places as well. Because yeah, like I feel like one of the things we talked about is just how like different, even in parts of America, like some parts of America feel like basically they're part of like a dying age. And then where do you find the vision of the new, which I think is like what you were saying about the even having a sense of confidence about the future. And so yeah, this is also part of our entire framing of the conference around DuBois, and our sense of confidence in the future. And I think one of the things that the music symposium proved and put on the table is that this is an immensely fertile time for new ideas, for new thought, for new consciousness, picking up the mantle of like these great revolutionaries of the 20th century, and what they put on the table. And I think like I like what you said about even this whole thing of where and how can the world civilizations meet. And it reminded me of a Tagore poem, which I think Nathan Reddy likes a lot because he's in the comments, but it's called On the Seashore. And Tagore says, on the seashore of endless worlds, children meet. Tempest roams in the pathless sky, and ships are wrecked in the trackless water. Death is abroad, and children play. And on the seashore of endless worlds is the great meeting of children. And that's kind of like, I don't know, that's kind of how I conceptualize even like how we think about the meeting of civilizations and of the world's people. But just to go over, I guess, where we're at with the conference itself. So currently we have plans for 2 main days of the conference here at the church on June 28th and 29th. And then leading up to the conference, we're planning to do a public lecture with Doc at Lucian Blackwell Library, in which we'll be kind of talking through, I think, the ideas from the essay that you're working on for the avant-garde issue, but I don't know, whatever feels the most
and
relevant.
building up for the conference.
Right. And, you know, that's also related to, because Doc had done a public lecture similarly at the Parkway Central branch earlier this year, the Chicago Library, also when we went to Chicago, and so it'll be in that vein. And then I guess just the main updates I feel like from our conversation this week, we're trying to work out. So there's a range of different, in the main parts of the conference, there's a range of roundtables, panels, in which the main distinction is panels require a bit more like presentations, although we're trying to keep that to the point and concise. But with the panels, we were especially, like Purba brought up, that we really need to focus on working out the panels. And so on the first day, one of the panels which has been proposed is originally it was Kant, Einstein, and Sun Ra, but now we're considering bringing in Lenin as well. So this is so we're trying to think, okay, like what will make sense in terms of timing, but also what feels necessary, what feels important for us to actually try to work out, and what do each of these figures represent, not just as figures in themselves, but also representative of different movements of thought and movements of philosophy. And then in some ways, Sun Ra representing the resolution to some of the unresolved problems that were put on the table by people like Kant and Einstein and Lenin potentially. And so that's one of the ideas for a panel amongst the different programs. And then on the second day, we were also working out ideas for that panel on the second day, which is basically investigating what Emily did today, which is how do you see the expressions and the manifestations concretely of the DuBoisian movement of world thought, especially in the 20th century, leading us to. And so some of the ideas that we talked about would be maybe Nandita talking about Tagore and India and China and how Tagore was working out this question of modernity, but really in concert with DuBoisian ideas, and also them kind of Nandita bringing in just like stuff that they've been working out in India, and kind of their observations and endeavors there. And then also, I think, we definitely want to have Emily probably do something similar where we're working on, okay, like Bandung, the world anti-colonial movement, how does it change our understanding of like basically human history to look at something like the Bandung Conference, but also more broadly through the lens of DuBois and the DuBoisian movement of thought. And then other ideas for that panel include kind of similarly examining the Black freedom movement and the civil rights movement through the lens of an expression of the DuBoisian movement of world thought, and similarly with Black music and art. So those are like that's where I feel like we spent the bulk of our time in working on some of the ideological content for those panels. But we've said, similarly to the music symposium, we want this to be a research conference. And so we want to put questions on the table and not presume that we've already answered the question, but actually to raise the question. Yeah, like even basic things like Shimbaku said. What do we mean when we say revolution? What does revolution mean especially in this time in the 21st century? What do we mean by knowledge? Like, why is knowledge an important task for people, especially Americans, but all people in this time? And to not presume that we've already answered it, but to actually try to put it on the table and to welcome people in and to be like, we're going to actually try to work out these questions together, which I think was such an incredible achievement of the music symposium, was that it really felt that we were all working out common ideological and philosophical problems together through figures like Mingus and Duke Ellington and Sun Ra. And so that's really how we really hope to achieve with the Knowledge Conference. And there's more roundtables and stuff, which we're also working out, but I feel like we haven't worked those out.
Can I just one thing? The universities as a central pillar of Western civilization will be, I don't know that we'll do like we did in last year, but it'll be an assume. For example, I think it was you pointed out the Gideon Rockman essay where he says the pillars of Western civilization are the dollar, the universities, and
Military?
They just put those two. But yeah.
no, there was a third.
Well, he says that the dollar and the American university are more powerful than the American military.
Okay, yeah, okay, all right. Well, that's cool because when you bring the universities into it, you have to ask the question, why are they so unable to produce knowledge? And at that point, and this is where, we have to get to the epistemological question, a failed and limited epistemology. And they've turned every way that you could turn and absorbed everything you can absorb, including Marxism. But so that's a high up part of what we're doing.
Right. I just wanted to add to what you were also saying that, I think the reason that we can talk about this in terms of a crisis of white civilization is also because then there's this thing about knowledge where we are on the one hand, we are talking about knowledge that's required for liberation. Like you have to know the world in order to be able to fight for the truth.
Absolutely.
But then on the other hand, knowledge has also been it has been gate kept as the property, as the reason for existence of white civilization. This is the project that begins with the Renaissance and so on. And then all the ways in which it's corrupted, that the slavery and so on. But today, knowledge itself, which has been the force behind, or it's the force behind the justification. This is what Robeson is saying.
Yes.
That this is the justification of white supremacy. Today, when this is the authority behind knowledge itself is in complete crisis, the university. Which way forward then? Which way forward for revolutionary knowledge?
This is, if I could just say just one small thing, this is a huge point because the justification, and you hear it every day with this attack, Trump's attack upon Harvard. If you bring Harvard down, you bring cancer research down, you bring space research down, all of the things that white civilization can guarantee to the world's people. There will be more children dying, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
Well, that's them saying.
Well, that's what Steven Pinker, he has this essay in the New York Times, and he's like, do you want more children to die? And that's why we shouldn't defund Harvard.
Yeah, right. Right. But all I'm saying is this, but that's the claim of the authorities. They say they have limited cancer deaths. They wiped out COVID, HIV is on the way out. And all of this is the result of the American universities. Our claim is that the American universities are part of white civilization, and thus they do not produce knowledge. And they do not produce knowledge that will produce the very thing the vision that Bandung and DuBois and the others.
Yeah, I think it's maybe even worth talking a little bit about how much we've gotten with the roundtable ideas. Okay. Okay, I can say something. The reason why we were focusing on the panels to begin with is because, like, I think these are the research arms of the symposium where we actually
Oh, yeah.
expect to be able to tell people who would be speaking a little earlier so you can actually study and research and put certain things on the table. And it's these none of these presentations are going to be like a recap of history or facts or anything. They're going to basically put new questions on the table which then can be discussed and through the conference taken forward. But one of the things that I think was significant for me in our last planning meeting was a certain shift in the broad focus of the conference from focusing on the crisis of knowledge and civilization to focusing on the resolution that comes from DuBois and his new movement of world thought. Because, I mean, the knowledge symposium we did last year, that was very much like, it did put at its center the student encampments and the fact that there was this beautiful, courageous movement of young people to take a moral stand and to say that we need a new basis for civilization. We need a moral education. And so in that conference, we focused a lot on what is the crisis of Western civilization, what is the crisis of Western epistemology and knowledge, and the fact that the university can't really take us forward. So it falls on the people to take a certain task up to take human knowledge forward. But this time, given everything that's happened since last conference to now, where in some ways we are seeing the unfolding of some of the things that we could have predicted on the basis of where we were last year. I mean, the state versus the university, this tussle, this loss of the ideological consensus, which we predicted was too weak and too fragile. And this time with like putting Trump in office, and we'll see how his presidency goes. But the fact that the people of America put him in office almost with a mandate to punish the elites and their elite consensus, which had kept them out and had stopped giving, stopped caring about ordinary people and so on. So this time we felt, or we've been feeling like we are in a stronger position to actually focus on a path forward because we have sufficient basis to say that this is a path that can take us forward. And DuBois, the correct recognition of DuBois's contributions to thought and to science is really, and so I think one of the things for me, it represents also that same kind of optimism and confidence that we were talking about. That without how sometimes you feel like, oh, I don't know too much about the subject. I have to read these many 10 books on this topic for me to be able to consider myself to be knowledgeable in order to speak on it. We also want to say that this is not the kind of knowledge we are talking about. We're not talking about knowledge which is expertise of facts or, we're talking about knowledge that's futuristic. We're talking about knowledge that actually raises the human consciousness. And we are optimistic that what we have identified in Free School as this new movement of thought can actually take us towards that kind of knowledge and towards the future. And so the panels are basically what Jeremiah just described, but we also wanted to begin the Saturday of the Knowledge Conference after reading the vision statement to have like a broad roundtable discussion of the state and the stakes of the crisis, where some of the things that Jeremiah was saying, like what do we even mean by knowledge? What is this crisis of knowledge? What is the role of the university in the broad life world of American society, politics and ideology? And why can it not take us forward? This tussle between, we want to basically have a broad discussion about that, to basically set the terms on which the rest of the conversation of the conference will go forward. And then another roundtable we're sort of tentatively planning to end the Saturday is to talk about this counter-revolution against cognition and knowledge, and especially its effect on the youth.
Yeah, the consciousness of young people.
Yeah, the consciousness of young people. So to end the day not entirely on a gloom and doom mood, but to also say that there has been an attack on young people. But what Jeremiah was also saying, all these, what you see across all these universities, all these students during their commencement speaking up for Palestine, you can still see, even if they're isolated incidents, you can still see that same moral striving to matter, to make their education also matter.
Well, I think it's just that, yeah, like whether it's the students or like more broadly young people in America or in the world, it's yeah, like people, I think all of us have felt this in some way or another, but it's like, yeah, people want more. People want more than what's offered to them by this, yeah, essentially like a culture of death, especially within American society and like American pop culture and all that stuff. We want to actually directly attack those things. And to ask, yeah, like, why don't young people deserve? What do we actually, like, what like children actually deserve?
Yeah.
In terms of a culture that actually uplifts them and gives them a sense of confidence about the future, rather than making them depressed and angry and violent and take things out on one another. And so we want to, like, directly address those questions with that round table on the Saturday.
Yeah, I'd forgotten to mention pop culture, but that's going to be an important, even culture as a mediary of, however you use that word, which mediates your relationship to knowledge, or which mediates how you. It does. I mean, the kind of music you listen to, the kind of movies you watch. I mean, it does color the way you think about the world. It does color what you want to be. If you're a child, what you want to be when you grow up. What do you think about beauty? If you think you're beautiful. So all of that. And the next day, Sunday, is the shorter day. We only started once. So we were only planning one panel and one round table. Maybe you can say a little. I like your formulation of that last one.
Oh yeah, so it'd be like the DuBois movement of one thought to start Sunday, and then the final round table would be essentially investigating what I feel like we've been talking about today, which is what is a new epistemology for a new epoch. And central to that will, I think, be the questions that Emily raised in terms of beauty and truth, and almost beauty as a criteria for
This is very interesting.
for consciousness, but we also want to connect it with questions of theology and these questions of why do black people need black gods, and potentially bring in stuff that we're also working out with, for instance, like the Minister Ishmael Muhammad interview. Potentially maybe bring back Sun Ra and questions of like an imaginary, and basically try to end with answering, okay, like what is our confident and optimistic vision of the future? Like what is needed in order to create and fulfill, a new way of looking at the world that actually meets the demands of an emerging new epoch for humankind. And so, I feel like that's kind of how I.
And we're having 2 round tables and 1 panel on Saturday.
That's a good.
So what are they now?
The first round table is the broad crisis.
Yes.
The second panel is the Kant, Einstein, Lenin.
Okay. All right. And
the third is the
it's pop culture.
counter-revolution, pop culture, youth.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, that's sort of it. Oh, and
I think we're also going to have readings of the book.
Yeah, we were also planning to have readings of DuBois on the second day.
And also launch the 4th issue of Avant-Garde on that. So everyone, you see lines of stress on people's faces, which is because people are working very hard on their avant-garde articles.
Not getting enough sleep.
But we're also trying to figure out how we can best work in a lot of the ideas that are kind of swirling around in the avant-garde issue, and to make them live and breathe in the conference itself.
We also said that we're not just going to announce the avant-garde issue as just like, oh, we're releasing it today, but to basically also make the case that this is free school's attempt this is free school's contribution to the new world movement of thought, where the questions we artists, we're writing essays on and so on, Nobody has worked these questions. Nobody's even asked these questions. And without them, can we actually move forward? So we were hoping to make some of the pieces from the avant-garde issue more concretely a part of the whole conference.
Yeah.
That's really good. Can I say something really quick? I'm still making sense of all of this as you guys are speaking, but I know previously, earlier today, we were talking about the immortal child,
Yeah.
like the child that we don't see in generations forward. But there's also the actual child that is born.
Say that again.
And there's also the actual child that is born or that exists right now and continues to be born. And even as I think about the science conference and knowledge, I guess what's standing out is the struggle of ideas. Because I think sometimes when we talk about the struggle of ideas, people are like, what do you mean? But the thing is, ideas and knowledge and all the sources of these things have concrete impact on people's lives and the decisions that they make. Because in previous preschools, we've also talked about how for the year of Baldwin, we had been at South Philly High School. And that's the thing with these high school students who are 15, 16, like all they see before them is like even the optimistic ones, they see their death ahead of them. And which is like, yeah, what is the purpose of my life and what can I do with my life? And on the flip side, and that's something that I have. I wonder if we can save their lives.
Yeah.
And on the other side, it's interesting because with my relatives in China, like, how do I describe this? My cousins who are maybe like in their mid 30s, and then also their parents, which are like in their 50s, 60s, them contrasting with the children that are born, it's so interesting actually that the ideas that they hold, where the adults of my parents' generation, like 50s, 60s, and then also of my generation, like in their 20s, 30s, their concept of the West is within the white supremacist view. Where for China, as it was developing industrially, feeding its people in the 80s, a lot of students were sent abroad, and there was this idea that the West had things that were to be desired, and it also was in the culture too. Like having Nikes and Jordans and this consumer culture, and then like wanting to go, this fascination with the West and going to it. But then my cousin's child, and this is like a sample size of one, but I think it told me something, which is that my aunt, who's of the generation of like, oh, like going to America is a great thing, blah, blah, blah. As I was on the phone with them, my aunt is like, oh, do you want to visit your aunt, which is me, in the US? And my cousin's daughter, who was like 6 years old, was like, no. Yeah. She's like, no. And she's like 6 years old. And she's like, because America has wars. Whoa. And I was like, wait. So she's 6 years old. She's definitely not talking about this with her peers. And so the education system is teaching them the sense of pride and being Chinese and not necessarily having to imitate or be white. But the thing is, it's not completely fulfilled because then the question is, okay, like China develops itself, it's proud, it develops like materially. Nuri actually asked this, which is like, previous generations, Nuri brought this up, which is that previous generations were making sacrifices so that their children could live better. But now the time is now, which is that these children are living better, like their material conditions are better than their parents. But then do they just continue to consume and buy more things or get more Jordans? Or is there a purpose of, is there a question of purpose? And essentially what we're talking about today is what is to be your life.
Mm.
And
Right.
because is it just a do for self, or is it that there's continued work for world peace so that not just China, but also people of the world can, like what Purva said earlier, can all be fed, can all live and ask this question of what is the purpose, or what does it mean to be human? And I think that's where it comes around to America, which is that Black people in this nation have been asking this question, because in the 60s the U.S. is, is dominant in the world. All countries are looking to the U.S. because of this industry. This question of like living amongst material wealth, but what about your soul? But I only bring that up because I think that's how I make sense of it. Because sometimes questions of like knowledge and philosophy and epistemology and knowing the world, we're asking these questions because these have effects on people's lives and the choices that they make. My cousin's daughter is not going to come to the U.S. because she thinks her voice.
Well, yeah, Fidel has a way of saying it, which I really like, when he's like, he has a speech to the UN and he says, "You're not talking about a new world order that no one understands. We talk about a world order that everyone understands." Yeah, like, we have to talk about knowledge, and like we talk about a new knowledge that everyone understands.
Yeah.
And I think also in centering the conference on DuBois, we are also centering the conference on war and peace.
Yeah.
And essentially, the question of freedom, because that's what DuBois did. He bent all knowledge toward basically, this question of how can humanity achieve peace and how can humanity achieve freedom?
Right.
That is the purpose of knowledge. And like a knowledge that is a thing for itself is not really knowledge that leads anywhere. And that is also what leads to the crisis of meaning, especially in the Western civilization, but also even for other people around the world who are also grappling with these questions. And knowledge has to have a purpose, and like consciousness has to have a purpose in order for people to have a sense of meaning in their lives.
And one thing we discuss is that, we see children as part of the audience for this conference, just like there were children at the music symposium. And that's going to be a hard thing. But, if we can win their parents, we can win the children. And I agree with you, Alice. A lot of this we have, in a certain sense, run by children. How do they respond to it? How do they? I agree with that very, very much. I know, I kind of know the children who were here because they were my grandchildren. So, I mean, I would prefer to say, "Oh, the children came," but they were my grandkids, and their parents brought them. So it's okay. But I got to make sure that I get their parents to bring them again. But that is such a profound question. First of all, about your niece in China. And I can imagine her saying it, how a Chinese child would say it. So declaratory, direct. No.
Absolutely.
Not just no.
And I'm not exaggerating. I think this is for real, the conversation.
No, you told me this the way. And if she's anything like you, I could hear the way she would say it. But that is, I think that makes, that's an instance we got to keep in mind, because I think the same thing with my grandchildren, who one of them is teaching herself, she's 13 now, I think she's teaching herself Korean, and the other is studying Chinese, the one that read the poem. So, it's things among children that they're arriving at conclusions themselves. And I don't know, I guess Blaze would know more about this because he's a teacher of children. but I'm very interested in children and how they view the world, because they can make a big difference, by the way.
Yeah.
If you want, we could if you want to, but we don't have
I
to.
guess we can.
Actually, I was going to say something to what like you and then Bob also said. I feel like, when we talk about philosophy, sometimes I think I definitely have a tendency of talking about it in terms of, something that exists out there.
Yeah.
And we are trying to know, that.
Absolutely.
But I think philosophy, ultimately, when we talk about it, it's really a way for us to understand how we think. And I think this is,
In part.
I think this is like the reason that, the reason I say this is because this is not, yeah, everyone has said this. This is not, we're not talking about knowledge, the way the universities have really trained us to think. But what has happened over the last, not even just 80 years, but I think part of the modern world is that these have been like idea of knowledge and philosophy and thought have been institutionalized to such a, to such a massive degree that we tend to think of them as something that like, belongs outside of us. But I think when we look at how, like, yes, of course, DuBois, but I think also the philosophers of the past, Kant and so on, the way they approach this question is really to investigate how do I think and how does humanity at this stage think?
This is very.
And I think everyone, all of us at this table and outside and their mothers, we all have, and this is the reason we talk about epistemology,
That's
is
right.
because we all have assumptions. We all have assumptions about the world. We all have assumptions about what our role is to be, like what our place is going to be. And what we are trying to do is, and I think this is also why we talk about modernity so much, is to really is to recognize that, is to become conscious of the fact that there is a way to know how we think.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah.
Well, see, if I could forgive me for just being too excited, it's because it is. Is thought possible?
Right.
Is truth possible? And is being human possible? If you think about contemporary America, it denies the possibility of thought for most people. It denies the possibility of knowledge, and hence it denies the possibility of most people being human in the fullest sense. It is, and as I think you said it, or Jerry said it, the academy is a culture of death. The United States is a culture of death. It is to kill. It's a long march to death, spiritual death, the opposite of Bandung, and that, you see what, and so we're trying to create the conditions for the opposite. Thought is possible. Truth is possible. Humanity is possible. You know what I'm saying? So we're not, and in this sense, we're not tiptoe or dealing on the margins of the crisis. We're going direct to the source of the crisis. And yeah, that's what, that's why it would be so, if we have children, and children are, I don't know, well, so you got, okay, all right, I have to admit, you got king-size children. You got some people that's so childish, 60 years old. I call that a king-size baby. I will start no trash. But you know what I'm saying? I'm talking about actual children, not people that's trying to be children at 50 years old. Okay. Yeah, the actual, not the fake. You get a 50-year-old cat, you push it.
I don't want to interrupt.
A baby cat.
Like, for example, when we read some Kant and for him talking about the conditions of knowledge, the a priori,
Yes.
which that's just cool as fuck, man. Okay. What they're talking about, like, oh, you need categories of space and time.
Yes.
But I feel like we have a similar task as Kant for, like, what are the conditions to create
Absolutely.
and produce and understand knowledge in our times
That's right.
of counter-revolutionary feats and huge uprising of the world's people throughout the world. And even like within our society, all these barriers we have that are putting ourselves at odds with each other, or putting especially the children into retreat from the world due
Yeah.
to such oppressive conditions of the heart. Just even just when I remember once we were talking to some parents, and they're like, or some grandparents, and they're like, I don't even want my children to like play outside the house. Like, I'll give them
Absolutely.
all the video games they want. I'll buy you anything you want, but I need you to stay inside.
Mm.
Like, what are the conditions for that not to produce that knowledge, which will allow ourselves to set ourselves free?
That's right.
I view that similar task in this period, and I view us as making an intervention in allowing that knowledge to come forward, especially with folks on the children.
It's really sexy.
Okay, I'll quickly read comments.
Okay.
So Bombalai 7, OMVR, also Crystal and Jonathan before they got here said good morning. Todd Doherty, I think, said good morning. And then Brother Jerome Muhammad said, Sister Emily, excellent recounting of the history. And he said, Mashallah, beloved. And he also shared a link.
You remind us.
Jerome shared a link to an article, a column by Mother Taneta from a friendship tour of Indonesia that she went on,
Really?
in which she mentions Bandung and includes photos of the Honorable Minister Farrakhan in Indonesia. So if you want to find that article, it's on Facebook. Jerome commented it in the Facebook live stream.
Nice.
And then Bombalai 7 said, look at how Germany drew lines with the ruler to create Papua New Guinea. There are artificial racist lines all over the world. And he echoed that Indonesia has been through a colonialist washing machine through the coup against Sukarno and all of that after. And then, the Jakarta method. M. Spark said, true that in terms of Saudi Arabia, them acting like a jive turkey, stuck between a rock and a hard place, saying that Saudi Arabia is two-faced. And then Nathan Reddy said, is there any connection between anti-colonial self-reliance like Gandhi's concept of Swaraj and I guess conservative emphasis on self-reliance with Swaraj, it was individual self-rule to achieve on a national scale. And then Bombalai 7 says, many Asian countries have also adopted the view that lighter skin color is better. Even in the Philippines, they say, ooh, a nice mestiza, light-skinned person, or a Moro, darker-skinned person. Magna says, this history gives a sky for the youth. It is no coincidence that as the university has become an arm of the state, Black and area studies, academics in Black studies and area studies attack Bandung. They teach a cultural nationalism to hide this history. And then she agreed with Doc that I hope that you guys can bring out these ideas in the interview with Minister Ishmael. And also, as we discussed, the Nation of Islam's contribution to world Islam and world religion. And then, someone said to check out Mao Zedong's talk on art and literature at Yan'an. And that BK said that we're making valuable observations, and someone named Tums says this is so informative. And then Bambala, someone wished happy birthday to John, saying happy making a revolution around the sun day.
Wow.
Okay, see you next week. Yeah. Thanks for the